How's it going? So as the stream says, we're going to try to answer this question today. Should the Democratic Party abandon trans people in the trans issue? Or, if not, what's the appropriate way for them to go about the issue? How do you handle such a controversial issue? We're going to start with the thing that prompted me to want to make this video. I mean, I've been wanting to talk about this issue in general, but specifically this week, I was listening to this Live and Learn episode the other day, and they start talking a little bit about the trans issue. And I thought it'd be a good jumping off point because they basically directly get into the conversation of is a trans issue a liability for the Democratic Party, and what we should do about it. And so we'll use that as a springboard. The rest of the video, after we kind of wrap up this part, we're actually going to spend some time doing what I've not seen any prominent media do, which is we're going to answer the question, what is trans? Beyond just the surface level, what is gender? What is the actual research on transgender identity? A lot of times we talk about the conversation as if there isn't a world of academia out there that's been trying to explore these topics, and there's absolutely no reason for that. And there's no excuse for the mainstream media to not educate themselves on those topics and present it to the American people. There is research on trans individuals. We don't have to guess. We have some data that we can go off of, and so we'll get into that a little bit later, okay? But without further ado, let's get started with this Live and Learn podcast.
I think
we did predict it.
Metal. Yeah, we're the only ones who called it.
Wow.
Not a single other person saw that coming.
Speaking of that, by the way, I don't fuck with this war. I don't fuck with it.
Do you fuck with the war, bro?
I don't fuck with the war.
Well, we're going to get into that later, but I'm actually curious. There's like a lot of interesting takes that aren't just war bad or war good. And, you know, people dying, saying people dying is bad, that's the easy take. The hard take is having a nuanced position.
Well,
let's
let's save that until Larsha goes. He's going to go at 5. And he said he's going to join in 2 minutes. So
2 minutes. Oh my God, we have to entertain the audience for 2 minutes.
Well, it's up to you.
Well, there is some breaking news. There's some breaking news that the Supreme Court is preserving for now. I haven't read it yet.
Do you guys fuck with the war? So on the topic of war, I just want to say a lot of times in the way that we talk about it currently is like this false choice, this false binary. I'm going to say something kind of crazy out here. I'm a progressive. I believe that sometimes war is necessary and war is proper. And I'll give you an example to kind of lead you to why you might think this. Like a lot of progressives, I think, would just automatically, reflexively, it's really a consequence of the Iraq and Afghanistan war that has given us this idea that war is just bad, period, end of discussion, right? Any war, any regime change, all of it's bad. But let me ask you this question. If you're a leftist and someone were to ask you, would you be in favor or opposed to the United States taking military action to stop Israel from bombing Gaza? Would your answer to that question be no? Because if your answer to that question is yes, or if you have to stop and think about it for a minute, what that actually says is that you're not actually 100% always against the concept of war. It's just a matter of when is war justified. And so I'd have a similar position there, which is that, you know, things like stopping the Nazi regime, I think that was a war that was worthwhile. I think the war against the Confederates was a war that needed to be waged, and I'm glad that we won that war. Sometimes war and intervention is necessary. The question is, and it's a hard question to answer, is when do you cross a threshold where the war is warranted from like a moral, ethical standpoint? You know, there's questions about international law related to this as well. And there's question of pragmatism, practicality. Just having the moral impetus for war doesn't mean that we would have the practical means to wage the war without destabilizing a certain region of the globe, or, you know, without actually executing that war in a way that would wrap it up, you know, as soon as possible, and then allow for whatever comes after that to be something better than what was before, rather than just creating a power vacuum that gets filled back up by another bad actor. in a few years, like we've seen some of those past wars. But that's not an impossible scenario. And throughout history, we've had examples of good and bad war operations. So there's a more interesting conversation in the way that we currently talk about it. But let's move on, because that's not the topic of this video.
The GOP held congressional district in New York City for 2026 elections. So I'll take a look at that and see what's up with that. But that would be probably some primo bullshit if that occurs. But I'll take a look.
What are the implications of that?
That the Republicans would have one more seat.
Oh, okay.
In New York. But overall, I should say the redistricting shit hasn't worked the way Republicans have thought, but that would be a setback.
And it would be for this year's maps? My understanding was couldn't do anything until 2028 maps.
My apologies, I'm still getting over, I think maybe a mild cold or just really bad allergies, so I have to like go to the side and blow my nose. I don't want to bother you guys with all that, but let's continue on here. Let's get to the meat and potatoes.
Redraw in New York, and the Supreme Court is staying that right now.
Gotcha. I don't care what these assholes.
I think it's some bull.
Strike down the Voting Rights Act, whatever, man. It's gonna be too big to rig.
Too big to rig.
Too big to rig.
How many people in your debates, Guy? How many too big to rig people do you meet who say like the 2020 election was rigged, the 2024 wasn't, even though the Democrats held all these positions? Do you get a lot of those people who say it was too big to rig?
Oh yeah, because I challenge them. You can't really talk about it on TikTok, but I do challenge them and I say, well, why is there no evidence at all that the Democrats tried to rig it then? At all, nothing. And they're like, they just have no answer for that at all.
I had a super chat from Dazra Donnie that said, is that the Supreme Court of New York?
That's always the $1 million question when people talk about election fraud and voter fraud and stuff like that. Ask them that question. Where's the evidence for it? But an even better question for this is the 2020 election. Make them acknowledge that there were multiple recounts and multiple audits. And even despite that, even despite having multiple recounts and audits, they still didn't have evidence for it. Once you have something like that, it's very safe to say to most people that these claims of election fraud, from the Republican Party is just bullshit. They had opportunities to present the evidence. They had multiple audits and recounts, and they've never produced evidence for massive voter fraud.
York or the Supreme Court? I thought the New York Supreme Court decided this, is what he said.
U.S. Supreme Court. So the United States Supreme Court. Actually, the highest court in New York is the New York Court of Appeals.
Yeah, the lowest court is the Supreme Court, right?
Yeah. Yep. Trial courts are, yeah. Those are the courts. There's it's super complicated, but yeah, basically.
Keep an eye on that backstage swipe.
No, he's here. All right.
Oh, there we go. Yo, what up, Laksha?
Hey guys, how you doing?
What's up, man?
Doing well. Good.
So as we're going to see here in a minute, this guy's like some sort of data analysis or something, or like a pollster.
Point of view, man.
And so I like data. That is a key feature of progressivism versus some other ideologies, is that we have an academic tradition that we lean on. A lot of people who are progressive have an academic background. We should lean on that more. Other ideologies lean on ideology first and foremost. Let's remind people, we don't have to shy away from it. We don't have to do this whole thing where the Republicans try to shame us for you guys, progressivism is just, woke college stuff. Yes, it is. Yeah, we have the educated people. We have the research. We have the data. We have the stats. We try to actually inform our opinions based on knowledge, based on data accumulation, based on empiricism. You don't. That doesn't make you look good. That makes us look better.
Yep.
That's good. That's great. Coming in good.
I was just telling my chat that I think that you're the friendliest friend of the pod, because is this your third or fourth appearance?
Third, I think. It's been fun.
Third?
Nice. Yeah. Well, listen, I wanted to invite you on because, well, frankly, there's just so much to talk about with respect to polling. I don't even know where to begin. Where do you guys want to start? I really don't know.
Let's work our way least to most contentious. Which things got Laksha the least flamed on Twitter and the most flamed on Twitter?
Well, can I ask you a question in general? Where are you standing on polling after the disaster of 2024? At this point, do you think that they've improved their methodology? How do you even feel about polls in general at this point?
This is an interesting question, right? Because I think until around 2016, polls were decently accurate. But since then, we've had, and it's not that all the polls are inaccurate now. It's that the media will fixate on the ones that were very inaccurate. But that's still, you know, it's still worth kind of pointing at and looking at that and wondering, like, why are these, you know, some of these polls so inaccurate in the era of Trump, and try to figure out what's going on there. It's a good question to ask.
I think polling is in a crossroad. Well, everyone always says this is at a crossroads and they just want attention. But like, what I think is really happening is that it has never been easier to put out junk data and get an audience. There is always going to be an audience built around telling people what they want to hear. And the way I can tell you about it is this, right? Like, a lot of these slop polls that come out are either from people who have been in the industry for a long time and their old methods don't work anymore because the response environments have changed. You know, like, it's a lot harder to get Trump supporters in polls now than it used to be. Like 30 years ago, it was not as hard to pick up people in polling, right? Now it is, because no one picks up phone calls, and social trust is so low that, and it's so polarized that the party of low social trust tends to get underrepresented in like big polls, like Trump voters. That's one of the challenges facing it. We all know about that. The other challenge is in credibility. Pollsters have taken a very, I don't want to say liberal because that's like a partisan term now. Pollsters have taken a very expansive view of some of the things that they can and can't do. And I think like that leads to things being put out that are just misrepresenting what the public wants. And primarily that's around issue polling. So it's very easy to get people to agree with you if you just phrase the question the right way. This is not just a moderate.
This is a very true observation about polling. You can load questions in a way that you can get people to agree with you. For example, right? If I were to do a poll and I were to go around and ask people, like, would you support a policy to give, you know, every man, woman, and child in the United States, every U.S. citizen, universal health care that's free at the point of service? You'd probably get a majority of the population to agree with that. Now, on the contrary, if I were to frame that question as, would you support a policy that would raise your taxes in order to give everybody universal health care? That number is probably going to reduce, right? Because I've loaded the question with like this scary feature of it's going to increase taxes. So that's going to make some people kind of pull back a little bit. Oh, okay, I'm not sure actually. Now, the other phrasing, the alternative phrasing is free at the point of service. Both of these things are kind of true, by the way, right? We're going to probably be substituting paying premiums for paying a higher tax rate. So we're probably going to be paying some taxes to fund the system, but at the same time, it would be free at the point of service. But depending on which part of that you're focused on will change the way that people will respond to the polls. And this is true, by the way, of basically all of like self-reporting surveys and polls and whatnot. You have to be careful about how you phrase questions in order to really know what it is that person's actually answering to.
Or liberal or conservative thing.
Yeah.
The liberal, the moderate Dem PAC Third Way had like a conference. One of their poll questions was, what do you agree with more? Abolish ICE and have no immigration enforcement in America, or would you like to reform ICE from the inside but not abolish it? I'm like, what the fuck, guys? Like, this is the kind of thing people call a bad name.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, a couple things there. The first thing that I'm thinking of, is it not true that 2024 was the best presidential cycle?
On that point, I mean, the right way to talk about the abolish ICE thing is it's almost like a false choice that is being presented. The way that he framed it is almost that false choice, right? The option is whether we abolish ICE and that's it, or we try to reform ICE, or we keep ICE. But there's a better option that is really like the true position that progressives should be taking, which is we abolish ICE. Yes, we will have immigration enforcement, because I'm just going to tell you right now, whether you like it or not, that is an absolute non-starter if you try to sell people on we're going to, you know, get rid of immigration enforcement altogether. You're not going to get a majority of the population supporting you. But you don't have to do that. It's a really simple thing you say. You abolish ICE and you replace it with an administration that's not corrupt and respects people's human dignity and rights. Very easy. It's not that complicated to say.
Polling that we've had since 2012, but then also please introduce yourself, because while we have a lot of regulars, maybe some people are not familiar with your game.
Yeah, so my name is Laksha Jain. I'm an ML engineer / software engineer by trade. But
he's a Maoist Leninist engineer.
Head of political data at the argument, but that's a fancy word for saying I run their polls and I write columns based on the polls that I conduct. So That's the main thing that I do. I do a whole bunch of political data. We founded Split Ticket like 4 years ago, and that's where you probably heard a lot about, like, for you folks on the call, the whole moderation versus like progressivism versus conservatism. That was like, we made a baseball type of metric, wins above replacement, to assess electability. So before this, that's what I did. And like, I don't know, I think blending software engineering and polling has really interesting ways to go about it. Lets you mine a lot of data and get a lot of cool insights that a lot of people don't think of. But then also, I think you just have a front row seat to like what's happening in Silicon Valley, and you're like, oh, I don't feel great about this sometimes.
Well, why don't we jump straight into you mentioned that you're the pollster for the argument. You came out with a poll, was it last week? And it seems as though every time you come out with a poll, it elicits the most like viscerally angry posts that I've ever seen for about 2 to 3 days. Yeah, why don't you talk about that poll that you released last week and get into it? Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that we did a poll on the public's opinion on trans rights. And the big thing that we
Here we go.
there was that the public,
this is where we get into
liberals, we as liberals have had this view that the arc of the universe bends towards justice, right? It's long, but it bends towards justice. And
I think that's still true. We can get caught up in where we're at right now in history, and it may not seem that way. But if you look throughout history, there's been setbacks all the time. These setbacks happen over somebody's, like, a generation or so. And it might seem to that generation that, you know, things are going backwards. But eventually things kind of rubber band themselves back towards. And I think it is true that history does bend towards justice. It just, the time scale might be a little bit larger than one lifetime.
What our poll showed is, at least when it comes to trans rights, we have seen backsliding in a way that basically no civil rights movement has seen in generations, right? You would have to go back to the time of like post-Reconstruction to find something backsliding this much. And what I would say, and what I wrote about was, I'm like, one way or another, the trans rights movement has completely lost the public opinion battle as it stands right now. And we showed our poll, which showed things like the bathroom bill, for example. If you guys remember the 2016 bathroom bill, Republicans lost a whole governor election over that, right? Trump won the state by 6. And then the Democrats beat the incumbent Republican governor because he tried being bigoted about bathrooms. And then people were like, no, wait, what the fuck? Fuck this. And then like a whole bunch of companies left the state. North Carolina got hit with an immense business backlash. Donald Trump was like, this is stupid. What are you guys doing? And that was like hailed as like the signature victory for trans rights. And so I was like, look, guys, 10 years on, bathroom bills are plus 20 in popularity. Something has gone very wrong here. And it's probably worth looking at the movement and figuring out like, where did they go wrong? Because yeah, the Republicans put in a lot of money, but like both sides are going to play politics over this. You don't just expect that like one side is going to be like, oh yeah, sure, go ahead. There's always going to be a side pushing.
What I think has changed is that the rise of social media happens during this time period. And once that happens, what we see a rise in reactionary content directed at young men, especially coming out of like the Rogan sphere. And I think this has had a massive impact on the way that young men engage with social issues. And I think that we have to be honest about something here, which is that I think that young men have been driving these social narratives in our country for at least the past 10 years. We have to be honest about that. I mean, there are some areas where, you know, women's what appeals to women drives a lot of cultural change, but particularly on politics and social issues, you know, social issues that intersect with politics, young men have driven these changes, and they've been influenced heavily by what's online. And one of the issues is that where they get their media from, where they get their information from, skews right-wing, skews reactionary. And there's been a failure by people on the left, people on the progressive side, to message in a way that is convincing to that cohort of young men. We haven't been able to counter it effectively. And they're going to get into this in a minute about how like people have responded to it in the past 10 years. It's insufficient. We need to recalibrate how we talk about the issue.
Against you. So I was like, something's gone wrong here. And you would think that I called for like the lynching of Joan of Arc.
Well, I want to say, I think the reason you're seeing so much anger about it is it's at the same time you see people shitting on Gavin Newsom for saying what I think can be perceived as common sense, but absolutely can also be perceived as throwing trans people under the bus when he says we need to focus on table issues and not pronouns. And if you view that as, okay, I'm not going to like be pushing for everyone to have their pronouns in their emails, it's like, yeah, a lot of people seem like as anything that deviates from their normal life, they'll be like opposed to regardless of what it is. But if it's, I don't want to help out or take an affirmative.
And like, think about that narrative for a second there, right? Having people use their pronouns in their emails. Be honest with yourself. So, everybody who's going to be watching. Is that really something that has affected your life? Like, did you genuinely have your work imposed? Like, you have to put he, him, she, her, they, them in your email headlines? When you read it, when you had emails from people, did you notice it? Did it really like upset your day? Did it really affect your work? Was this really an issue? Or was it something that was manufactured as a narrative among right-wing media that a lot of young men were consuming? And then turns into a meme that everybody's paying attention to. But like, if you really take a step back and you think about your life, like, let's be honest, this didn't really affect people. I was never in opposition to the whole idea of people saying their pronoun. I don't really care. If you want to say it, if it's more comfortable for you, if you think you need to do it, I'm fine with that 100%. It doesn't bother me. I don't know why it would bother somebody else. I never bother with it, and it's not because I don't support it. I never bother with it because I think, frankly speaking, like, people just kind of look at me and they have a pretty decent idea. I just didn't really need it. But it's not because I was in opposition to it. But the people who are in so much opposition to it, why did that bother them so much? Why does it matter? Like, why does it bother you? I hardly ever noticed it. I really did. I would have people on like Facebook and Instagram who would have their pronouns in their bio. I barely noticed it. It drives me, or it strikes me as really weird. Genuinely, even if you're somebody that's like hyper progressive and everything, ask yourself genuinely, like, do you even really notice it all that much? I don't think we do, right? But the young men who consumed right-wing media were told over and over again that this is like some big, crazy cultural change that they need to be worried about. And it was just like blasted in front of their face 24/7 that it was a big issue. It never really was a big issue. But that's politics. Politics is not governance. Politics is how you motivate people. It's how you get people enraged, get people motivated, get people excited, get people happy, right, to engage with politics. It's how you build up political capital. That's how you shift the Overton window. And that was a process of doing that, was convincing all these young men that it was a big issue that everybody needed to pay attention to. And it was like, some canary in the coal mine for everything else in society.
Affirmative stance on trans issues, that could be really bad. And so when you introduce this poll at that same time, people see that as, oh, so therefore we should go with the polling and not support a bathroom bill. Where my opinion on this is, I don't know about you guys and weigh in, we should take an affirmative stance and say, I don't give a shit that 53% of people are strongly supporting this, like, trans people need to use their birth sex bill. I think that's stupid. And I think we should take an affirmative stance and try to push people the other way. But that's just me.
Well, I think with Newsom, one thing I want to point out is the reason Newsom's getting that reaction is because nobody trusts him. It's not about what Gavin Newsom.
I think this is fair and true. Now, I did a video, of course, you can watch it on my channel, where I really dug into his background and record and everything. And I think there is an element of this, like he comes off very much as like a politician, where he's very kind of practiced and polished, and he has a certain look about him. And I think sometimes people feel like maybe there's a lack of authenticity there, and there probably is to a certain degree. And you can perceive that as distrustful. Now, my impression of him is that he does come off a bit polished, but that's because what he actually represents is somebody who tries to govern for his constituency. He has a progressive leaning, but he tries to filter it through a lens of, how do I generate public support? How do I accumulate, political capital? How do I get enough of a coalition to get stuff done? And in doing that, in the process of doing that, you do have to make concessions. You do have to kind of moderate yourself. You do have to, pick and choose your words wisely. It doesn't really necessarily mean that you're a distrustful person, but it can come off that way to people.
Newsom is saying, it's about the fact that Gavin Newsom is saying it. Look, I'm from Santa Clara. I grew up 20 minutes from where Gavin Newsom went to college. He grew up in Marin County. I live like less than an hour from that now. So trust me, everyone here knows Gavin Newsom or his, someone in his orbit. Gavin always does what's best for Gavin. It's not a secret here. And the reason Gavin Newsom got that reaction is not because he said we need to be more common sense on these issues. What he said is what Bernie Sanders has been saying. Like, no one wants to be police, just let people be. But when Newsom says it, you don't trust him.
Yeah, it is interesting because there's been some left-wing political commentators on some shows. I think Majority Report, TYT. I think even Bernie Sanders, like he was saying, has used similar rhetoric to the idea that, like, we're not going to focus on identity politics per se. We're going to focus on, like, universal health care, right? Or whatever other things. And I've always been in the position, because I think we've been shamed out of embracing identity politics, but identity politics doesn't have to be like the most extreme thing that people need to be afraid of. I try to remind people, like, there's good and there's bad identity politics. Bad identity politics is like white nationalism. Good identity politics was the universal suffrage movement. It was MLK. Like the whole civil rights era, MLK, like you have to acknowledge it, by definition, was identity politics. It was politics built around how do we get this particular identity in society to have equal rights. That's identity politics. It's not that identity politics is bad, it's that there's good and bad identity politics, and sometimes there's a way to talk about identity politics, and there's ways that are less helpful.
That's the thing.
Can I ask, Laksha, is there a broader element about trust with respect to the Democratic Party that they're doing enough in terms of the messaging? So let me give you a following statement, something like, Democrats haven't spent enough time or money messaging strongly on trans issues. Would you agree with that sentiment, that Democrats have sort of dropped the ball in terms of their messaging if they're losing this much ground?
I think they've dropped the ball in terms of their messaging. This is one thing where, by the way, I actually do have some sympathy from, like, I do have sympathy towards, like, the online crowd saying Democrats kind of failed them. Not because Democrats started voting for a bunch of anti-trans legislation. It's objectively true that the Democratic Party is better than the Republican Party. It's night and day, especially on trans rights.
Right. Yeah.
But now I'm going to add the but. The issue of what wins Democrats' elections is not the same as, can you advance trans rights? Those have overlaps. Those are not the same thing.
I think this is an important distinction because I myself am somebody who's very supportive of trans rights. But for a general population, you have to remember, like, what is the trans population of the United States? It's probably like less than 1%. And then of the general population, how many people are like strong advocates and supporters of trans issues? A little bit higher, but still a very small minority of the population, right? It's not that you have to throw out trans rights, trans issues, protection for trans people, but for a general population, that's not going to be the thing that motivates most people to, you know, show up and vote. I hate to say this, but most people think about kind of themselves, their family, the issues that are in front of them. If you're watching this, for example, you are exceptional. You might lose perspective of that. Most people don't pay attention to politics like we do. Most people aren't really thinking about issues in like this broad sense and how it affects, you know, millions of people. They're thinking about what's directly in front of them, how to get through the week, what are their bills for the next week and stuff. So it's not a matter of you have to throw out trans issues. It's a matter of what do you focus your limited political capital on. And again, I'm going to get into this a little bit later. I do think that there is a way to talk about trans issues that would be not off-putting to a general public. But again, it doesn't have to be the primary focus. It could be one of those other elements that, like, hey, we're going to talk about universal health here. We're going to talk about, you know, how do things make things more affordable. We're going to talk about anti-corruption. And also, we're not going to throw anybody under the bus either, right? That's like one way that you could talk about it. Anyways, let's keep going here.
And the issue here is that with the Democratic Party, the more they talked about trans rights, the more ground they lost. And so at some point, they said, we cannot talk about this, or we really, really need to see ground. And I think
it's a matter of
true,
how they talked about it
to get here. And the way we got here was that people picked the most ineffective ways to elevate this issue in salience, the most ineffective ways to platform it.
Yes, I think that's true.
And, you know, Democrats started taking the Republican bait on a lot of the culture wars too, which I found pretty disappointing in hindsight. And I think so, Pisco, to your point, I don't think it's that the Democrats didn't message enough on trans issues. I think it's more like the way they did it and what they did ended up picking all the wrong fights and picking the angles that voters disagreed with us on. That's what I think happened.
Can you get into more detail about that? Like, in what ways do you think this was the case?
Sure. So, like, one of the pieces that I have coming out actually like Wednesday is literally what happened with the gay marriage movement, and why was that like so durable, right? Like in our poll, in the same poll, we found that 66% of the country is in favor of gay.
Yeah, if you're not old enough to know this or to remember this, you would be blown away by, if you're like Gen Z, for example, you were too young to really experience this firsthand. You would be blown away by how anti-gay marriage the country was in like 2004, even 2008. In California, we couldn't pass it. It was legalized by the Supreme Court. It was not legalized via legislation. It was legalized by the Supreme Court. But after that legalization, I think one thing that happened was that once that happened, there was an initial shock for a lot of like normies. But then I think most people realized over time, like, oh, this doesn't really affect my life. It's not a big issue. So all of the like fear mongering that the right had, you know, sown into the population for years and years and years, people kind of saw like, oh, you know what? All this fear mongering, like it really hasn't really changed much of anything. Like it's not a big deal. Other thing I wanted to say is the normalization of gay people. I think one of the things, unfortunately, for the trans population is they're a smaller portion of the population. Gay people are more visible because there's just more of them in the population. So there's this concept in sociology about how if you don't really have a lot of experiences with other kinds of people, you know, you're not going to really have a good like empathetic understanding of those people, right? So if you have more gay people in the population, they're more visible. You know, you could be like, hey, my coworker's gay and he seems like a pretty cool guy. You know, my brother came out, you know, a few years ago and it was a little bit weird at first, but we all got used to it. And, you know, actually, there's nothing wrong with it, right? Not a lot of people know trans people. So it's like a structural disadvantage there, you know, unfortunately. But I was also going to say, there was a show that I remember watching when I was a kid when gay issues, being gay or whatever, was still pretty taboo. My uncle introduced me to it, and I don't know if he had actually come out at the time yet or not, but it was called Queer Eye for the Straight Guy. And I think that show did a lot to normalize gay people and show them as like nice, productive, you know, members of society who buck whatever the stereotypes were at the time. Maybe we need something akin to that in the mainstream media to try to normalize, you know, trans people. Show your average normie person that out there that like, hey, you know, they're not this scary stereotype that the media kind of makes them out to be. Like they're just normal people like you and I. You know, everybody's a little bit idiosyncratic, everybody's a little different, but like they might be a little different from you, but at the end of the day, like you can get along with them. You know, they put one shoe on at a time when they get ready in the morning. So on and so forth. So I think maybe something like that might be helpful. I'm not really sure exactly what that looks like, but it's just something that kind of came to mind when I was watching this. So let's keep going though.
Marriage being legal, something like 66%. And this is near its all-time high in support. Even as you saw the backsliding in gay rights, or in trans rights, gay marriage is at near an all-time high in support, including by plurality of Trump voters. How did this happen? The way that it happened is the activists in the movement made a very conscious choice to change the framing of the movement from one about morality into one about fairness. So with the gay rights movement, opinions started to change on this long before people thought it was morally acceptable for two men to have sex with each other. There's a lot of people, even now, who think it is not morally acceptable for two men to have sex with each other, but they also think they should be allowed to get married. And with the trans rights movement, the argument wasn't necessarily just in terms of fairness, and fairness wasn't necessarily even well defined. I'm going to bring up the sports issue again because I think it was actually pretty central to the whole start of the Republican push. They didn't start with the bathroom bills. Like, they didn't start gaining traction through the bathroom bills. They picked the weakest issue, the one where most Democrats don't agree with the party, sports.
So on this point, I mean, the bathroom bills issue almost kind of predate, my recollection is it predates the trans sports issue being the main thing that they're pushing. And I think this is kind of the point that he's making, which is that they weren't gaining traction. The Republicans weren't gaining traction on the bathroom bill stuff. So once they started pivoting to the trans sports stuff, that had hooks, that sunk in, that had a lot of like cultural sway. And so you started to see Republicans shift their framing of the conversation to focusing on that specifically.
And Democrats then didn't have a frame back, so a lot of people started fighting on the sports issue. The gay rights movement made a choice to frame everything in terms of fairness. What is fair? What should we do? And they also learned to accept half measures. They learned to start. Civil unions are not the end goal, but they are a good middle point so we don't backslide. We work incrementally.
Yeah, there's something about this strategy here. I can't really think of like how to robustly convey this point here. But the idea, for example, if we take like civil unions, this was before we had gay marriage. Some of the states were legalizing civil unions as like almost like a separate but equal thing. It's like, okay, it's not exactly a marriage. We're going to call it something different, but kind of the same thing. But think about what that does at a cultural level. Civil unions are almost basically the same as gay marriages, right? Not exactly, but you know, for a general public, it's kind of like, oh, well, that's basically the gay marriage. That's the gay version of marriage. But then people get used to that. And it's like, okay, well, we have civil unions now. It's pretty much the same as gay marriage. We just call it something different. But we have that for a few years. And people get used to it. And they have time to acclimate to it. And that makes it easier then to take that next step of, well, why don't we do gay marriage then? Why don't we just like eliminate the separate but equal thing and just make it marriage across the board? And that's an easier step to take for your average normie person who isn't really deep into like progressive, you know, LGBT circles, because unfortunately just not the whole country isn't. And so for those people, I think that's a good way to kind of move things in that direction.
The trans rights movement had a no debate culture, which the Democratic Party continued to foster.
I think this part is also huge and true as well. And I'll let him talk a little bit more, but I'll chime in on this in a minute.
Activists with its staffers online, where all the journalists are, that had the effect of radicalizing elites against them.
What do you mean no debate culture?
So there was a thing where in the late 2010s, the no debate culture was this. On a trans rights issue, it would be no debate that whatever went for cis women went for trans women. If you disagreed, you were a bigot. Now, listen, I am in full support of people using whatever bathrooms they want. Okay, like I think this is a really stupid issue. But I also recognize this is not an issue where there is broad agreement on it. So you can't have a no debate culture. You need to be like,
yes, I've said this before in other videos that I brought up. You can have a like dismissive attitude when it's a topic that, you know, other people, you know, in the audience, in the broad, you know, general public or whatever, are gonna be able to just kind of go along with you with it. If it's a topic that is controversial and the other side seems to have a lot of sway, you can't just say, oh, well, you're silly, you're stupid, you're dumb, we're not gonna debate this. You have to debate it, because their argument on the other side is making headway in the general public, general culture. You have to fight that issue. And I think he's right. In the early 2010s, I think it was like a foregone conclusion that society was moving in a more socially progressive direction, and that was the momentum of our politics. And I think a lot of people, number one, they didn't really know how to argue these issues. They were a fish out of water there. And then number two, I think they thought that they could just kind of ignore these people, push it off to the side, and we'll kind of breeze past it. But that didn't wind up working out. With the bathroom bill, for example, that had some sway during that time period. And one of the arguments that came out of do you guys know what the argument is against the bathroom bill? I mean, there's different arguments, but one of them is what? Who's going to be checking your genitalia at the door? As far as I know, by the way, yours truly created that argument. But it's a good argument. I realize that we can't just step away from that argument, because the right was pushing that bathroom thing out there, and it's salient because a lot of people who don't know any trans people in their lives think that they're scary. They don't really know about them, and they think to themselves, like, is it possible that there's a trans person who's just pretending so they could prey on my daughter, right? That is scary to most parents who don't know anything about trans people. You have to have a response and answer to that question. So it's a good question, right? What are you going to do? You're going to put people in front of the doors and you're going to have them like check my balls and give me a reach around before I go into the restroom? That's insane. That's crazy, right? And it flips it on them now, because now that's the scary thing. What's scarier to you? The odd chance that there's a trans person in the restroom, which, by the way, if you're in a public restroom anyways, you really can't. I mean, how much can you trust strangers in a restroom anyways? But a scarier thing is that, we're going to have people at restroom checking our children before they go into the restroom, or checking us before we go into checking women before they, no, right? So you're flipping that scare tactic back around in a way that they now have to respond to.
Okay, we will persuade you that this is okay.
And it goes something like this, right? It's like, I'm not going to debate my humanity with people. I'm not going to debate my right to exist with people. And that, like, to even give air to this conversation is itself some sort of attack. And
you know what? Like, I understand that sentiment. I understand where it comes from. I can appreciate it. I can understand if you are a trans person, like, you shouldn't have to. You shouldn't have to. But unfortunately, that's the world that we exist in. And since we exist in that world, then I'm going to take that fucking fight because, like, we have to. And I'm not just going to abandon it. We have to take that fight. So we will take that fight.
And illegitimate in some way. That's how you are characterizing it, right?
Yeah. That's it, right? That's exactly it.
Would you say
another one that we've seen recently, right, is what is a woman? And I've been incredibly disappointed with people's responses to what is people's response to this question? What is a woman? Oh, well, a woman is someone who identifies as a woman. Okay. A woman is someone who hides their drink from you. I mean, that one's cheeky. It's funny. I like it. But you're really not getting to the meat of that question. And that question is a popular question. We cannot deny that question has had cultural significance. But a lot of people don't know how to argue that question. There's an answer to that question. And again, we'll get into it a little bit more deeper in this video here. But here's the answer. And I want you guys to remember this answer and use this answer in the future. Number one, you can do it this way. You can ask them, do you agree, because they'll probably agree, that men's brains and women's brains are different? Do you agree that there's a difference there? You know, your average reactionary conservatives say, of course, right? And they think that you're giving them a layup. But then you establish, okay, well, we have research. We've looked into the brain of trans individuals, and it turns out that they are conveying something. They're not making it up. They're not daydreaming or fantasizing. They're not trying to play a game. When we study the brain of trans people, what we find is that their brain chemistry, the patterns, whatever you want to call it, is similar to the opposite sex. So their brain is actually gendered the way that they say it is. And so what is a woman? A woman is not the genitalia. That's your sex. The gendering is your identity, but your identity is a manifestation of your brain, of your mind. Your brain, the brains of people are gendered. And that's a little bit reductive. We'll get into the details later. Brains are gendered, and trans individuals are gendered the way that they, report that they're gendered. And we have that. We have data on that showing that that's the case.
Say that this kind of culture is one of the reasons why you have a situation where I can't remember who was giving testimony on Capitol Hill, and the Republicans, like, I feel like all of them were just asking this person, like, just define a woman, and the person just refused to define a woman.
Was it the confirmation of Kentucky?
Maybe was that it?
I mean, it's not the only time they've done it. So they've pulled that card a lot. Yeah.
But there's like such an obvious answer to this, which is like a woman is an adult human female, and we also have trans.
That's not a good answer. See, even Hutch doesn't really get this. If you give that as an answer, then you're conceding the argument. You're basically conceding that you don't. And here's the thing that I run into is that a lot of people who are advocates for trans issues, it's like they don't really have a good solid foundation of how transness integrates into their understanding of gender, sex, and the worldview. Hutch probably doesn't either. He probably has an impulse to protect the gender, but he would, if he tried to enter this argument in a debate, the other person would say, oh, well, you made a contradiction there. And they'd be right about that. But again, there is an answer to this question. And it blows me away, by the way, that people who have a living like debating this kind of stuff or presenting news on it, like they just don't know how to make this point. It's actually not that complicated.
Trans women, and like you can make these kind of distinctions, but there's a sort of pushback to make any kind of distinction between a trans woman and a cis woman. And I feel like that instills a sense of fear that the person is going to be, castigated by the progressive bloc if they adopt that framing.
I just want to put out there, I don't think it's that simple. I think even the definition for biological human female, that if you were to probe that a little bit further, there's some play in the joints, there's some uncertainties. It can't just ground out into things like production of large gametes. It can't just ground out into certain chromosome arrangements. And so I actually don't buy that. I think we do need gender studies and a lot of stuff. So I want to put out there that I know, and I agree with
that would be helpful, right? If we included in, I don't know, I guess sex ed or anatomy in school, like an understanding of this, because it's a real world phenomenon and it's becoming more of an issue. So like this should be a topic that maybe we cover in our education system. What is gender?
And that famously the Ketanji Brown Jackson hearing is there, but I actually do think it's more complicated than people give it credit for, even the fundamental questions.
But it definitely seeds the ground to all the people, like, they won't even have the debate. They're shutting down your speech. And that was like part of the reason they were able to capture so many people who ostensibly don't agree with right-wing politics, but also we're like confused at the lack of conversation here, because most people don't even know anything about trans people, let alone see a debate about it or anything like that. So,
right, which is why this is why I think it's good that if the fundamental questions, what is a woman, what is a female, if those questions are like kind of complicated, and there's some edge cases, there's these different conditions, that means that we need like even more gender studies. We need even more conversation and open rhetoric, in my opinion, about that. If we want to get to brass tacks.
This is where you lose people, because people are not able to comprehend that.
In the chat, we got Capacifica or Kai Pacifica. I think you're asking a question. Is there a trans person on this panel? There's not. Are you asking like why not ask to have a trans person on? I think that's a good question, right? We should probably bring them on, have them talk about it. That'd be useful, maybe have them speak to the issue. The reason that I'm even watching this panel is not because like it was supposed to be a larger panel with like different topics. So it wasn't like they were intending to linger on the trans issue. And actually, if you watch the whole live stream, they go through a variety of topics. But yeah, I mean, you're right. If you're having a conversation about trans, like trans issues specifically, I think either have a trans person on, or I think even better than that is why not have somebody, like it's a meme that people talk about like gender studies, but like gender's a thing. Why would you not study it? And so why don't we have those kind of experts on? I always hear other people describe what gender studies people are like. I never actually see like an actual gender studies person put in front of a camera and actually explain their science, their study. Why not? What are we afraid of? Why don't we have them talk about it? Why do we always have people like other people, oh, gender studies is stupid, it's silly. Okay, well, why are you giving me an explanation of gender then? If you don't know shit about it, you didn't study it, what makes you think you know anything about it then?
Sort of stuff. And the big thing here is,
if you don't think it's a study, then
Democrats and
why are you even saying anything about it?
A lot of activists kept getting suckered into taking the debate on this and starting to fight on Republican issues. What the Republicans did on trans rights was the inverse of what the gay marriage movement activists did in the 1990s. Okay, so in the 1990s, what we saw was this: the activists would, for a long time, like gay marriage was basically fighting a losing battle because people viewed it as a moral issue. So activists made a conscious choice to shift the debate to one about like familial love and individual rights. And it didn't change the public's opinion on the morality of the matter. But what they managed to do was they changed the frame of the debate. And as they changed the frame of the debate, the other side started adopting that frame and talking in that frame. So the Republicans here started talking about sports. They took the fairness advantage and they're like, all right, we're just going to talk about fairness. We're going to talk about fairness in sports. If Steph Curry was trans, would you say that Steph Curry could play in the WNBA? This is a stupid question because no one is going to say yes to that answer, right? Like no one is going to say, yeah, it's fair for Steph to play in the WNBA if Steph becomes a woman. No one's going to say that. But that's the frame that people will.
I mean, yeah,
when the trans and sports issue became a thing, what was interesting to me is before it became a big thing, I had studied in college. One of the classes in philosophy was, one of the big questions was performance enhancing drugs in sports. And if you understand that debate, you understand that the trans sports issue is just an extension, an evolution of that same debate. And we won't get deep into this part, but it's just kind of an interesting conversation, is what that debate we used to break down to is what does it even mean to have fair competition in the first place? All competition, all sports is trying to see which particular competitor is better than the other. There's always an element of like, inherently you're trying to see which competitor is better than the other, right? But our concept of sports involves some understanding of like the people that are competing are on like a generally kind of in the same range. You're not going to have like a professional basketball player play against like the Pee Wee Hut team in 3rd grade, right? And, you know, of course, sports have been separated by, you know, sex for a long time now, also acknowledging that. And then if you look at things like MMA, martial arts, boxing and stuff, like those are they have weight classes, right? So we're always having these categorizations where we're sectioning off people in sports to try to make people who are kind of generally in the same tier compete with each other.
The fringe will, and I think that's the point that Laksha is making. But I do want to push back a little bit, Laksha, because you said that the Democrats ceded ground.
Okay, so from Kai Pacifica, we got, okay, got it. When this came up on my feed, I didn't know this was a watch of a prior conference I was offering to give information about trans. Oh, I see, okay. All right, so if I'm understanding correctly, you're trans yourself. Well, I mean, chime in, feel free. You're on the chat there. If you have anything that you want to chime in with, you know, by all means.
On trans issues, but in my opinion, unless you want...
Obviously, I mean, this conversation affects you more than anybody else, so I mean, you know, I'm happy to hear what your thoughts are.
When I get into detail, and maybe you're privy to stuff that I'm not aware of, but like on the issue of Gavin Newsom, I'd say at best he ceded ground rhetorically in a very superficial way that didn't actually walk back support for trans people. Because if you listen to what he said, just real quick, and let me, I'm almost done. If you listen to what he said was, of course, people have a right to be concerned about fairness in sports. ... So he validated the concerns, which is like, say what you, right or wrong, probably 90% of the country have these concerns because it's just been thrust into the mainstream so often and it just comes up so often. But he followed that up with saying he doesn't think that the state should get involved in regulating these kinds of things. So he's not actually giving any.
Here's a question that no one ever seems to ask in this debate here is like, why are we even getting the state involved in sports in the first place? Because this actually used to be my position when we used to talk about like performance enhancing drugs in sports, which is like, if you want to have a sports league where everybody's shooting up and you just have dudes that are like super roided out and playing baseball or something, like, I don't care, go for it. This is a private organization. You can have different sports leagues that have different criteria, different rules, different ways of like grouping people out and everything. I don't know why the state even has to get involved in the first place. And I actually think that that's a strong argument that people could be making, that we don't pay attention to arguments like that because, like the other guy was saying here, we take the bait on the way that the Republicans frame the issue and we're fighting them on their framing of the issue. We could like sidestep it entirely and go like, why are we even getting the state involved? I thought you guys were small government. These are sports leagues. They're private organizations. Let people compete how they want to compete. You have the UFC, you can have Strike Force, you can have different, leagues for different kind of criteria. Now, when it comes to sports in school, okay, it's a little bit different there because, yeah, there's going to be some government involvement because, these are going to be like public schools and whatnot, and it's dealing with children. But like as a broader conversation with adults and with private leagues, why are we even, making this a matter that's up to the state in the first place?
Any kind of policy grounds to Republicans whatsoever. He's just kind of slightly meeting them where they're at.
Also another question nobody asked: which sport? Which sport are you talking about? Are you talking about equestrian? Are you talking about motorcycle racing? Are you talking about long distance running? And the reason I bring these up is because, as far as I understand, I think these are ones where women have already been competing with men. So it depends on the sport. Every sport is testing different things mentally and physically. Is it possible that biological males have an advantage over biological females in some sports? Maybe. I don't know. And I'll be the first to tell you that I don't think we have enough information. Everybody that has like a strong opinion, they don't have enough information either. We don't have enough information at this point. But what I do know is that every sport is different. And what I do know is that before I make a strong opinion on that, it's possible, despite our intuitions, despite our preconceived notions, it's possible that there might be sports that women and men are able to compete on without there being some huge biological disadvantage. Again, later on in this thing, we're going to get into the actual data here. It's my understanding that there's actually a good amount of data showing that trans individuals in these sports leagues are not winning at a higher rate. Now, again, take it with a grain of salt. We're going to look at that and we're going to dive into the details. Okay. But I'm just saying, things in reality don't always turn out the way that we think in our intuitions. And if you've learned anything throughout the long history of humankind when it pertains to science, is that our preconceived biases, our notions, our cultural upbringing yields to science every time.
And acknowledging and validating people's concerns about fairness.
And where I disagree is I don't think Democrats ceded any ground on policy on trans issues. That is not what I'm talking about. Okay. I actually completely agree with you. The Democratic Party is the reason that trans rights is not a -70 in the United States right now. Because if the Democratic Party adopted the position of half of their base on trans issues, you would see public support for this collapse. The Democratic Party is the one thing standing between like basic existence for trans people.
I wouldn't say that they're the one thing standing in the way, but I think he has a good point here in that the Democratic Party probably isn't given enough credit for how much of a political liability the issue is, and yet they've made an effort to, it's not 100%, but they've made an effort to stand by the issue. And he's right. If the Democratic Party tomorrow decided that they're just going to go full tilt anti-trans, he's right. The public sentiment for trans issues would probably just collapse because the general public would look at, okay, well, pretty much everybody agrees that trans issues are bad, right? So there needs to be some credit given there that Democrats do take a political liability trying to protect trans issues. It's just a question of like, how do we do that effectively?
And like a deep catastrophic backsliding that makes the UK look like Vermont. So I'm not here to say the Democratic Party is backsliding on trans issues. That's not the point. What I'm saying is how you choose to fight a battle matters, right? If someone is your lawyer, and fairly or unfairly, that's kind of what the Democratic Party is in right now with the position of trans people, right? Like,
I think it's a really good analogy.
If someone is your lawyer,
and I think this speaks to like the liberal left wing LGBT sentiment of the Democratic Party, which is he's going to get into this a moment here, that even if the Democratic Party ostensibly, from the vibes or whatever, supports us, supports our issues, if you had a lawyer who's supposed to defend you in court, even though they want to defend you, but they're just really shitty at it, at some point you kind of look at them with like disappointment and you want to fire them and hire somebody else. And so the Democratic Party, it's not just enough for them to be supportive of these issues. They have to be effective at it, because they are kind of like your representative. I mean, that is what a political party is, right? It's a group of people who want to represent you. They want you to vote them in to represent you as their constituency. Much in the same way that a lawyer wants you to hire them to represent you in court. And so the Democratic Party has to actually get good at this issue. They can't just like, oh, we support it. You have to actually be good at supporting people on this issue.
And they keep,
and that's fair. That's fair to ask.
Yeah, you'll probably like, yes, they're better for you than the prosecution is. But that doesn't mean that they're doing a good job for you. And the Democratic Party did a really good job with legislation for trans people and legislation that protect.
I mean, honestly, this is the same argument that I hear a lot of times from Black Americans, which is like Black Americans will acknowledge, like, yeah, Democrats, they support us way more than the Republican Party does. But like, there's a disappointment because the Democrats just haven't been very good at actually kind of pushing the needle on some of those issues that they have.
To trans people's rights. But when it came to the frame on this debate,
same thing with leftists, frankly speaking, and people who are interested in labor issues.
This is not where anyone intended. And if you want to say that, like,
I'm somebody who oftentimes will push back on the left for not giving enough credit or trying to think pragmatically and strategically. But on the flip side of this is true, right? That if you're in some of these groups here, you have like, it's pretty legitimate for you to be disappointed. You have somebody who is like dysfunctional at their job. Do your job, do your job better. You have one job and you're not doing it.
We stand up for marginalized communities. It is fair to say that we have failed, the activists have failed, the trans movement has failed over the last 10 years. And it should not be controversial to say that. Saying that gets everyone mad at you, but I think it is what it is.
Well, are you positing that if we had the same legislative policy, but maybe we framed it in a way, because I think this is a good way to frame it. If you look at kind of how the weird stuff, like the calling of people weird, took off when Kamala replaced Joe Biden, in the same way saying, why do you care so much about what these people are doing with their lives? Don't you want them to be able to make their own choices? If they were to frame this that way, we would have a more successful Democratic Party and a more successful trans movement.
I think this is a good framing, and I've seen people shift in this direction, which is to point out, like, it really actually genuinely is weird how obsessed right-wingers, conservatives, Republicans are with trans issues. And I think that this is something that the average voter actually agrees with, which is live and let live. I don't have to agree with the way you live your life, but like, I think most Americans have this sense of, even if I think you're weird, even if I don't like the way you live your life, we have a system where everybody gets to kind of do their own thing and you leave people alone to do whatever they want. I think if you point out that Republicans are obsessed with this issue and they will not leave it alone, and it's weird, and they act like a weird bully that's obsessed with bullying this group of people, I think that's salient. I think that works, and I think that flips things around and puts kind of like Republicans in a defensive position, looking like the weird ones on this topic.
I don't know that if the policy was the same, everything would be the same. I don't know that. I can't say that.
Well, you suggested that if the Democrats adopted what the most democratic, the constituent.
All right, so Kai Pacific in chat, can I break down something controversial but basic to this entire situation for you? Sure, yeah, go ahead. I'm going to play this a little bit. I'm sure you have to type it out, so go ahead and do that, and then I'll respond to that.
Constituency says this would plummet trans rights because it would bring unpopular issues to the forefront. But if you took an affirmative pro-individual rights stance on this and pushed this and tried to change the legislation and the mindset of people in the same way we did in California with Prop 8, like pushing for gay rights, and did this countrywide, I mean, you saw this transformation happen on an issue that was unpopular. Is there not some path for Democrats to message differently and have the same ethics for protecting trans rights and actually push this conversation in a positive direction? Because clearly it didn't work in the way we wanted to in the last 10 years. But that doesn't mean that trans rights are a failing issue. It means that potentially, hey, people got really upset when they had to have pronouns in their emails or something silly like this that ultimately doesn't matter in terms of protecting trans people versus like making sure they can get hormones. So like, how do you push that conversation and actually protect these people?
So to be clear, when I said that if the Democratic Party had adopted the position of what half its base wants, right, like the position that support for trans rights would backslide a lot. What I actually mean is this: like, I think people don't understand how many Democrats believe that this is just that how many Democrats actually disagree with the trans rights movements. I'm not talking about taking positions like trans sports, like, oh, let Steph Curry compete in the NBA. I'm not saying that. I am saying the other direction. There are a lot of Democrats who are very, very conservative on trans rights and are still Democrats. I can literally pull up.
He's talking about the voter base, to be clear.
Concreteness there. So, for example, people who believe that Title VII, other sort of employment protections shouldn't be extended to trans people. Is that a widespread belief? Other sort of bills on people over age getting trans-related transition, medication, surgeries, that kind of stuff. Is that a belief that's widespread among Democrats? Can you fill it out a little bit? Oh, here we go.
Yeah, it's in his poll. I mean, like, yeah, you can see that even people that voted for Harris are still not like overwhelmingly supportive of certain issues for trans people. Yeah.
For minors, right?
Yeah,
but in terms of
about puberty
no, I can give you some hard numbers. Okay,
sure.
People who believe that saying you are a gender that is different than the one you were born as is morally wrong. Okay, 20% of Harris voters believe that. Okay, 20% of Harris voters believe that. 71% disagree. So my apologies. Should not have said half. It is more like 1/4. Okay, 20 to 70. That's the ratio. 20% of Harris voters just straight up believe that if you identify as a gender that is different from the one you were born as, it is morally wrong. So when I say if Democrats wanted to adopt
Kai, so the title is supposed to be a little bit salacious. You know, I'm trying to take advantage of the algorithm. But also, the intention is to answer that question in this stream, and the answer to that question is no, obviously. But what I do want to propose is that there's a way to go about it, which I think is potentially more effective than the way they've been going about it. Okay, so they say in chat, the transgender was a term coined by Virginia Prince, a crossdresser who wanted to be able to use hormones. Okay, interesting. I didn't know that.
Adopt the position of a good chunk of their base, which, by the way, let me be clear, that includes 50% of black voters here. 50% of black voters believe that identifying as a gender different from the one that you were born as is morally wrong. If Democrats took that point of view, you would see what we see is that the base tends to follow their elite leaders as well. So that's what I mean when I say that there would be a lot of backsliding.
Got it.
Right. And so, but the converse of that is if we took a more affirmative position, there's a way that we could push some of this electorate.
There's a way to talk about it. There's a way to talk about it better, right? That's basically the theme of this whole thing. One of those things is going to be, you know, spoiler alert, we're going to get into this more later, is I don't think the general public has an understanding that trans is not a choice. I think the general public thinks that trans is something that you can just kind of choose to do and be. But it's not. The research that we have seems to indicate that that's not the case, that it is like encoded in your brain. Much in the same way that if you're a cis person, if you're like a male who identifies as a man, you didn't choose that. That's kind of how you are, right? Same thing if you're a woman who was born as a female and you identify as a woman, you don't really choose that. That's just something that you kind of developed into. And it's the same thing. But the public doesn't know that. The general public thinks that that question is still up for debate. But part of the problem is that the media has not done a good job at all in informing the public why we have the impression that that's not the case. Because it's not enough to just say, no, you're wrong, no, you're wrong, no, you're wrong, right? Everybody's like disagreeing with each other. Do we have strong evidence? Do we have strong arguments in one way or the other? And we do, but nobody talks about it. We'll talk about it in a little bit.
To being more trans accepting, no?
But that's what we tried, right? For 10 years, that's the type of thing we tried.
It's not a binary, right? It's not, oh, we tried to be pro-trans, that sucked. I think a lot of the pro-trans messaging was like, even to me as a pro-trans person, was really like annoying and like very virtuous signally and not very effective.
Yeah, we agree.
Guy, I feel like you were trying to jump in a minute ago.
Well, I just want to say, I understand there's been setbacks with the trans movement, but we have a trans woman in Congress. We have a trans woman who was confirmed by...
You know, this is also fair to say too, which is that the reality is that we have come a long way actually from where we used to be. It's easy to kind of, you know, get lost in kind of the moment that we're in and lose track of that, lose perspective of that. But like, go back 20 years, go back 30 years, go back 40 years, go back 100 years. We're way, you know, better than we used to be during those time periods. What we're living through is a time period where we have like some ups and downs. We're taking one step forward and one step back, one step forward, one step back. But if you look at the trajectory over time, like it would have been unheard of maybe 30 years ago to have a trans representative, but we do now, right? It's not like the whole country is behind that, but that is progress. It really is progress. There are areas where we've made progress, and I'm willing to bet that we've made progress with the majority, not the majority of the country, but the country as a whole. I'm willing to bet where we're at now versus where we were, let's say 40 or 50 years ago. I bet that the general support for trans people, they made, like, the general public may not agree with being trans for some of those aforementioned reasons. But I think that the general public population, I think most people's perspective on it is, you know, I may disagree with it, I may not understand it, but you're American, we have freedom here, and they should be able to do what they want if they're adults, right? I think that is the general public sentiment on it. And that probably was not the case 40, 50 years ago. We have made progress in that respect. We have a lot of work to keep doing, but, you know, it's worth mentioning that. Okay, in the chat from Kai, and people who were not transsexual started transitioning. The floodgates were opened and society became confused and angry by what they were seeing. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I suppose, I mean, I think transgender people are a minority of the population. So why do people even like think that there's a floodgate of this happening? It's from the media that you consume. Because the reality is, like, most of the people around the country have probably never even met a trans person in their entire life, but they have a huge impression of them based on what they're fed online, right?
By the Senate, including Republicans. So while I feel there are steps back, there are some steps forward. And I feel like the public acceptance of trans people must be there to some degree if we have someone representing, you know, so many people in Congress as a trans.
I mean, I appreciate Guy's optimism here, but I think that it's important to temper that with, like, yes, we have made progress, but we are absolutely in a position right now where we're experiencing a lot of pushback, more than we have, let's say, in the past 10 years. And so it's not all rainbow and unicorns. Okay, I know there's a LGBT stream, but it's not all rainbows, okay, and unicorns. You have to acknowledge that there is a lot of hostility, a lot of pushback right now, and we have to meet that moment.
Woman who's well respected. So I try to look for the wins as well.
I mean, is Sarah McBride really respected? One of the first things that the Republicans did was to
probably by her constituents enough to vote her into office.
That was literally like they did that like the first week. And so, you know, I take your point, but if you're a trans person in this country, I don't blame anyone that is in that spot for feeling nervous about the
for sure,
given the slew of anti-trans legislation we're seeing at the state level. And
that said, though, that action by the members of Congress who did that to her, I think to the average person who saw that, they saw the Republican Party acting unhinged. Like, the average person out there may not know a trans person, they may not really understand, they may not get it, but they probably also don't agree with, oh, bully this person, harass this person, focus on, like, targeting them for harassment and abuse. So when the Republicans in Congress did that, and for those who aren't aware, I forgot what her name is, but this trans member of Congress, historic, right? Won an election. She goes in office. As soon as she does, Republican members of Congress start like harassing her. Basically, they start like creating new rules in order to basically like, you know, make her feel weird and different and like she doesn't belong. And it was pretty unhinged. It was beyond the pale. It wasn't simply Republicans being against, you know, transgender sports or whatever. It was them like actively bullying a coworker. And I think that the average person watching something like that comes away with like, okay, I may not really super be on board with all this trans stuff, but like, you guys are acting really freaking like rude and disrespectful and like hostile and aggressive. Like, I'm not cool with this either, you know?
Red states. So, yeah.
I'm not dismissing that. I'm just saying that there are some huge steps forward as well.
Yeah, I mean,
right. But I mean, here's what I would.
You guys discount that? Does anybody?
If you're watching and you enjoy my content, please subscribe.
As assistant health secretary and a trans woman in the House of Representatives is not a big deal.
It's a big deal, but it's also you're looking at like, okay, that's her district versus like nationwide. How is this issuing, and how many people are using this as like a wedge?
Her district, though, 50, 60 years ago, like probably wouldn't have been able to do that. So it is progress. Slow progress, but it's progress.
Well, I've always felt that that's how you get these newer things accepted by America is like people see somebody just being normal who lives life like that, whether they're gay or whatever, and they start to accept it and it moves forward. So I do agree there's been missteps with what we've been pushing for, and the messaging may not be working in many ways, but I do think to me that's a sign of progress.
Yeah, and the congressman like misgendering her like in front of everyone, I think was like such a good clip of wow, you just look like an asshole to like the average person.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is like I think good messaging for pushing normies more towards pro trans stuff. Also, I have to say before I forget, Lakshya, I think you have a bad batteries on your smoke alarm.
Dude, I know it started this morning. I really hate it. And I honestly, I was like half debating asking you guys, can I step out and fix that shit? Because it started 2 hours ago and I'm so annoyed by it already.
We don't live in
It's always 2020. I would not have had this thought in 2016. What the gay marriage movement did was they learned to accept certain half measures to secure what they had and then continued pushing on acceptance in the rest of the areas. So they learned to neutralize unpopular frames before they took off. In this case, I actually believe had the Democratic Party not fought on the sports issues and framed everything in terms of fairness, and then if they were asked, do you support men and women's sports? They'd be like, no, this is stupid. Stop debating about this. No one's talking about that. But why do you believe that trans women should need to use the men's bathroom? Is this what you want? And pull up like a picture like Kim Petras or whatever and be like, do you want her using the men's bathroom? Is that what you want? Had they done something like that, I think you would have seen a very different outcome from what you had. It involves a little bit of policy moderation, which is undeniable. It does involve a bit of policy moderation. The second thing it involves consistently and in a disciplined manner, taking the framing of fairness and sticking with it instead of fighting on the other frame. And what Democrats did was the worst of both worlds. They picked the policies that were unpopular, elevated that to fringe issue, or took the Republicans' bait in elevating that into the central issue. And then they watched everything get tarnished with that in association because they were so afraid to lose on anything that they lost on everything.
I want to wrap this up.
There's an important point outside of even this specific issue. I like to think about politics sometimes as like playing a game of chess. In chess, you have your pawns, and your pawns are like they're pawns. You use them in order to get strategic positioning, and sometimes you use them as bait in order to get somebody to overcommit to a position, and then you take their piece. The pawns are low value pieces, so you can compromise on those. But what you're doing is you're compromising on those lower value targets or goals or whatever it may be in order to win the larger game. And so we have to, as a movement, as a party, whatever it may be, understand that we are playing a chess game and there will be sacrifices that we'll have to make. Understand this. This is not a question of whether I like it or not. This is a question of reality. There will be sacrifices we have to make. There will be. The question is, what do we sacrifice? What is the larger goal that we're working towards? What is our strategy? And so this extends to everything else, which is what things can you temporarily put on pause, put on the back burner? What things can you take smaller moderation compromises on in order to see the larger picture, to move towards that larger position? We have to think about that more. We can't just get lost in the moment. And again, we can't just get baited into the way that Republicans want to have the debate and the argument, because guess what? They're playing chess too. And they have an understanding, especially their political operatives, their political strategists. They understand this. They understand that they are putting pawns out there so that we take the pawns so that they win the larger game. We have to understand that we're going to avoid that bait in order to focus on the larger goal that we're trying to move towards.
By just getting to sort of brass tacks,
ignore the pawn. It's bait.
Do you think, if any, do wedge issues and culture war battles over trans issues, how much does that actually translate to electoral consequences? And well, yeah, I guess that would be the way to end that. I mean, I have kind of a broader point. Like, I feel like, how much do you think Democrats having a reputation of being too scoldy and mean plays into electoral consequences, like negative electoral consequences?
I think that's a narrative. The narrative that Democrats are too like woke scoldy or whatever it may be. Sure, there's probably an element of that somewhere here and there, right? But if you look at Republicans do this too. This isn't a unique feature of Democratic politics. This is a feature of everybody's politics throughout all of history. There are ways that you message things. There are ways that you shame people or whatever that overextends yourself. And that's the case with every political party. But Republicans have made a concerted effort to frame that as a uniquely like Democrat progressive thing.
Trans issue kind of like a part of that, or do you think the trans issue itself is actually?
I mean, just think about the way that conservatives talk about stuff all the time. Oh, you're beta, you're a soy boy. What is that but scolding people and trying to shame people? It's the same thing. It's just their version of it.
Causing meaningful changes in outcomes of elections.
I think it's.
So in the chat, we got Kais says, problem is the trans community created by the open floodgates and backlash has radicalized and is too scared of small steps. Yeah, I mean, my perspective on this, I think, is that there is a lack of trust with the trans community directed at kind of like the Democratic Party and the larger public as a whole, because I feel like there is a sense of abandonment And I think out of that is a lack of trust, that if there was a high level of trust between the different coalitions in this movement, that yes, we are working towards this goal, we are trying to strategically maneuver towards it. I think if that trust was there wouldn't be as much fear about this. But because they don't actually feel like they can trust that they're not going to be completely abandoned or sacrificed as a pawn, they don't trust that the small steps are genuinely working towards a larger strategic goal. So what do we do about that, right? How do we build that trust? And I think that we just need to be maybe a little bit more honest about what the big game plan is, so that we all understand what it is and we understand that there is a plan that we're moving towards.
So I'll be careful here. I don't want to say it doesn't matter. The public uses some of these things as like a competency or sanity check. Okay. So like if you're Rob Sand in Iowa, you can't just go and say like, no, I think that the sports issue is like, I agree with the progressives on this. You can't say that. You will lose some vote at the margin for it. You will not lose that many votes. Even the Trump is for you and Kamala's for they, them ad, that wasn't even Trump's best ad. It was a good ad, but it wasn't the best one. And that ad rolled in illegal immigration, transphobia, and crime into one ad, right? Which, God, what the fuck was a VP thinking in 2019? Anyways, see, when I say unhelpful shit, this is exactly the type of thing I'm talking about. But I don't think you would lose that many votes on this, because in our poll, Democrats led by 6 at the same time as the public's view on trans people was the most hostile it had ever been. You can clearly win elections even despite keeping this. And that is a choice for people to think about. Do you want to just stick where you are and let public opinion kind of guide you and then like change based on that? Or do you want to just say like, you know, screw public opinion. We are what we are. We stand for what we are, and we will win or lose elections on other things.
It's a little bit of both. It's a chess game. It's political capital. How much political capital do you have to dedicate to shifting public sentiment on a particular issue versus knowing where you need to kind of moderate and concede in order to kind of move to that bigger picture? It's a balancing act.
Republican Party has a lot of unpopular elements in their platform. They still win elections too. So, you know, both sides can do it. I won't say.
And the reason for this, obviously, is because when someone goes to that voting booth, they're thinking about more than just one or, well, some people are single issue voters, right? But it depends on what's important to them. And like, so let's say that we have a Democratic voter who is anti-trans for whatever reason. They think, you know, maybe they're super duper religiously fundamental and they don't believe trans should be a thing and we shouldn't, all that good stuff. But they still vote for the Democratic Party. You might be asking yourself, like, why would they do that? Well, maybe it's because they also think that the Democratic Party is better for their bottom line because they're a working class voter and they're worried about like their wages and they like the idea of universal health care. So to them, their, you know, dislike of trans people, trans issues, it may not be the biggest issue on their mind. Their bottom line in terms of their paycheck and universal health care and the effect it has on them and their family may be a bigger priority to them. So you have to remember, like, voters are not just voting on this particular pet issue. They're those voters out there have their own interests and their own things that they're focused on. And they may have a wider view of different, you know, they may be balancing a bunch of different issues, and it may not just be that one issue.
Say that this is the big thing holding Democrats back. I do think that it hurts on the margins in red states in policy, and people should get freedom to break from the party on that. Does that answer the question?
It does. Yeah, it does. I mean, I'd love to spend more time on that, but I do want to get to these other topics too. So I don't know. I think there's 3 things. I want to talk about Tallarico versus Crockett. I want to talk about Platinum versus Mills. And I want to talk about the 2028 primaries. So why don't we just do it in that order? Give us your thoughts right now on the state of the race in Texas. If you had a gun to your head, who do you think wins the Dem primary? Who do you think wins the Republican primary? Who do you think wins that general?
Tallarico, Paxton by 2.
Oh, that breaks my heart. It makes me sad. Why?
Okay, Kai in chat says, seriously, both parties should be fighting for trans people. Why? Both parties claim to be fighting for secure rights, medical autonomy, pursuit of happiness. Republicans claim that, but they don't mean it. Republicans don't act like these are slogans. They evoke Americana, freedom, liberty, eagles, flag, star and stripe. Like these are empty words. This is unironically virtue signaling by Republicans. That's all it means to them. Freedom is a slogan. Rights are a slogan. Pursuit of happiness. Like those are just slogans for the Republican Party. The reality is that what the Republican Party represents is it represents white Christian nationalism. And then on the other, they have like 2 constituencies. They have that constituency, and then they have like the oligarchical, rich donor class constituency. And their goal basically is to convince the former to support the latter. So the former being the right Christian nationalist segment of the country. So they give them a lot of imagery and slogans and, fear mongering around those things so that they can get into office. And then once they get into office, they're able to give kickbacks to the oligarchical business class that they, actually genuinely represent. But Republicans don't actually believe in rights they don't believe in rights for Muslims or for minorities for that matter, or for, LGBT people, or they don't care about when they say like small government. They don't actually mean that. They just mean that they don't want the federal government to come in and tell them to stop, discriminating against people. That's what that actually means. When they talk about rights, they're talking about their rights. They don't give a shit about your rights. Yeah. So basically, let's move on.
St. Paxton. What do you mean?
I will say, I don't have a high degree of confidence in that. Paxton is probably one of the worst nominees I've seen since Roy Moore. And I mean that with all my heart. I think Dr. Oz is a slightly better nominee than Ken Paxton as well.
Okay, so let me see if they talk about the trans issue anymore in here, because otherwise I'm going to move on to, we're going to actually get into, we're going to read about gender, we're going to read about sex, we're going to read about biology. We're going to see what the actual science and data tells us. Because nobody else does that, and we need to be doing that. We need to shift the conversation. You want to shift the public support for transgender issues? Start educating the public on what these things actually are and what the data actually says. It's malpractice that our media has sat on this information for 20 years or so, and nobody knows about it. Nobody talks about it. Why don't we do that? It makes me mad.
Dr. Oz said crudité in Pennsylvania.
Okay, let's see. Do we got anything else here about trans stuff?
I think it's interesting that he's kind of weaving.
Well, you have to do a lot to win a Trump plus 15 state. We are talking about.
Okay, so I think we're done there. All right. So let's get into gender and sex now. So to begin things off here, let's just first start with an idea of what are words. Why are we starting here? Because the world that we look at around us does not have labels for fucking anything. The world does not care. The universe does not care. The universe has no concept of a table or a Xbox controller or a computer. Those are human-made conceptions. We are looking at the world around us and we're creating words to describe patterns that we see within the world. And sometimes we fall a little bit too much for our own patterns. And what I mean by that is that the world is probably a lot more continuous than we think it is. There's continuous and there's discrete. When you talk about something that's continuous, there's more gradients between things. Things kind of blend into each other. There's not really a clean, sharp, super definite distinction between things. That's the way we want to view the world. That's probably not the way the world actually is. We want to view the world as a more discrete thing where a chair is discretely different from a floor and different from a house and so on and so forth. We give words to communicate concepts and patterns to other human beings. That's what that is. When we talk about gender or sex, what are we actually talking about? When we talk about sex, we're trying to refer to a sort of there's different definitions, right? There's a cultural definition of that. There's a biological definition of that, right? But basically what we're trying to get at is there are males and there are females. Well, what is a male and what is a female? Because in science and reality, a male and a female is a collection of chemicals, collection of molecules that form a larger superstructure. But we see that for Homo sapiens, for humans, there are two prominent patterns of human beings. We have males and we have females. Those patterns are patterns. They're not the actual, genuine, continuous reality that exists before us, because you have genetic abnormalities, you have deformations, you have people with, triple X chromosomes, you have people with X and Y, XX, you have people with X and 0 and stuff like that. The universe, nature, doesn't give a shit about these distinctions. The universe doesn't look at that collection of genes and go, oh, that's not the right combination of genes. The universe is, oh, that's just a combination of different molecules. It is what it is. We give the definitions to the patterns that we see in the universe. And again, sometimes we buy into them too much, and we think of something like male and female as if these are actually more binary than they actually are. What do I mean by that? Look at this panel right here. I mean, look at me, for example. Look at this panel. These are all males, are they not? But look at how different they are. This one right here wears a pinwheel hat. What the fuck is up with that? This guy right here has his hat backwards. He's a pretty cool guy. This guy's brown right here. Why is there a brown? I'm just messing around, but you get the idea. Like these two guys have glasses. They need glasses because their eyes don't work as well as maybe these guys do. This one's bald. Okay, this one right here has like dark patches under my eyes from not getting enough sleep. When we talk about male, we're talking about a pattern, and sometimes we forget that male is just a abstract. It's an abstract category that we've made to describe what in reality is a variety of different genetic combinations. But these genetic combinations have a little bit more in common than the genetic combinations that form what we call female. But even among females, there's a lot of different kind of females. What do we actually mean when we what does it mean when we talk about the X and Y chromosome, for fuck's sake? How many genes are in an X chromosome? 800 to 1400 protein coding genes. These genes are vital for various functions, including sexual development, and represent 5% of total DNA in a human cell. What about this question? How much are Gorillas tickets? How much genes, this isn't grammatically correct. How many genes do males and females have in common? Because man, we talk about it like these things are like worlds apart, but we share like 98% of our DNA. So males are like 98% females. I'm being a little bit reductive, but you get the idea here. In fact, the female of the species is the phenotype. It's not until you get that, what is it, the Y chromosome, that you have changes in utero that cause the transition. Whoa, they cause the transition from what is phenotypically like the female default to start having adaptations that turn it into the male pattern. But like what I'm trying to convey to you guys here is that we get caught up sometimes in the categories that we've constructed to try to take a world that is way more complex than we see on the surface and try to make it something that we can communicate to each other. Almost like when you have a giant plate of food and you're trying to, you're trying to eat it step by step, spoon by spoon. You can't take the whole thing in at one time. You have to take it in smaller spoonfuls. But the reality is sometimes we forget that the reality is that it's actually way more complicated than we make it out to be. I mean, I'm familiar with this concept too of like a bimodal distribution for males and females. Vosh turned me onto this, right? But like this idea, and like I'm not sure exactly how this works. Maybe we'll read about it in a little bit here, but like you're gonna have some overlap at the edges, right? Because think about it again. How is this even possible? Well, because we share 98% of our fucking DNA. Of course there's gonna be some overlap. There's a lot of overlap there. And when we talk about gender, when it comes to, we have sex, we have gender. Sex is your genitalia. Or maybe some people define it as your X and Y chromosomes. And by the way, what is a Y chromosome? A Y chromosome is like an X chromosome that's missing part of it. So X and Y chromosomes under a microscope. Let's look that up real fast. Microscope. You may have never really thought about this. Why do we call it an X and Y chromosome? This is an artistic representation. It doesn't really actually look like this. It looks like this. Look at this baby back fucking bitch chromosome. This is the male chromosome right here. This is your Y chromosome. And we call it a Y chromosome because it has this little stub right here. It's almost like a leg, and then you have two coming out this way. So it's almost like a, I don't know if I can make my fingers form that combination, but you get the idea. You have two stems coming out, or two branches coming out, and then you have a smaller stub, so it's like a Y. But the X has 4 lobes. So the Y chromosome in reality is like an X chromosome that's missing 2 of its lobes. That lack of fully realized chromosome is what causes a male to become a male versus a female becoming a female. You understand how much overlap there is there. You understand how, like, when we call it male and female, we're heavily reducing down what's actually going on a biological level. So we have that. And then what I also want to say is, what was I going to say? Where was I going to go with this? I hit a brain fart here. Let's look at, I might be kind of shifting gears a little bit here, but let us look at now. Oh, that's what I want to talk about. Okay, so we have genes, right? We have on these chromosomes like 800 to 1400 genes, all the different combinations of those genes. You have for males versus other males, right? Some males are taller than others, right? We don't define a male by like, oh, you have to be this specific height, or you have to have this amount of hair on your chest, or, you know, your balls have to be this size, or your dick has to be this long, right? There's a wide variety even within males. What we call male is really just kind of taking all this distribution of different genetic combinations, but there's a little bit of similarity between this grouping of genetic combinations. Let's look at that bimodal graph again. Bimodal sex. It's not that every male falls right here in the fucking middle where we call like our idealized male at. They don't. It's not that every female falls right here in that idealized center of where females are at. It's that you have females that have a variety of different forms, and you have males that have a variety of different forms, but there is some similarity where they kind of congregate. You have two patterns that these groups are congregating around. That's what is kind of going on there. But what is gender, right? What is gender? Gender is a decision that we're making to assign a word to a pattern that we're seeing out in the world. Much in the same way that we've decided to attach the word sex to a pattern that we see out in the world, even though the actual thing that's going on a biological, chemical level is way more complicated than just male, female. There's variation in there. There's a fuck ton of variation in there. And even like what a male is like a alteration of the female phenotype. But we just call it male and female, and we're done. You know, nothing else to talk about there. No, there's a lot more complexity there. But when we talk about gender, we're talking about what? We're talking about identity. What does identity mean? Identity stems from your mind. It stems from your brain. When we talk about it's a social construct, it kind of is, but the reality is it's actually a biological construct. We are social beings. We are socialized. We have culture and things of that nature. Our culture is a manifestation of our biology. Cats don't have the same culture as us. I have a cat, by the way. Dogs don't have the same culture as us. Giraffes, elephants, they don't have the same culture as us. Our culture is a manifestation of our biology. It makes us do the things that we do. It's not magic. It's not unicorn farts. It doesn't come from, the luminiferous ether. There's a biological reality to gender. Hold on, before I move further, we got some comments here. So Froggone says, actually XY chromosomes don't make some be born males, as there's cisgender males that are X chromosome. Yeah, and Froggone is right about this. And before we move on, let's just look at that real fast. There are even XY and XX, like even this it's a pattern. It's not like a hard rule that the universe has to follow. It's a pattern, because they're right. You have people who are born, holy shit, I shouldn't have typed that in there. What I meant to look up was, you have XXX female, you have XXX tentacion, but you have women who are born like, you got, XX chromosome, right? There's women that are born with 3 X chromosomes, women with 3 X chromosomes. Oh, triple X syndrome, right? And then you have like so let's look this up. What are all the chromosomal combinations in reality? There's 45. There's X, you only have 1 X chromosome. There's XXY, there's triple X, there's XYY, there's XXYY, there's XXXXY, right? I believe that there's a 0 too, or like a circle or some shit like that. But you have a wide variety of different, you might call them abnormalities, whatever. The universe doesn't care. to the universe, these are just chemical combinations. When we call it a defect or an abnormality, that's like a normative assertion on our part. We are a mutation, for example, right? We evolved from like simple-celled organisms. A simple-cell organism might look at us and say, oh, you're a fucking defect. Look at you, you're not like the rest of us. And they're right. We are heavily genetically modified from whatever the fuck we came from. But we don't think of that as a bad thing. Why? Because we have a preference for this combination that was a long combination of genetic mutations over time and genetic drift and whatnot. These are kind of like normative claims that we make about what is a disorder and what's not. Because again, what is language? Language is us giving definitions to a world that's more continuous out there that doesn't give a shit about these definitions and categories that we give it. The world is a lot more complex than the simple patterns that we want to assign to it. So you have a variety of different genetic combinations and different, XY, XX, whatever the heck they may be. I thought there was a O, X, Y, and O chromosome. Am I tripping? Am I tripping balls here? O indicates a missing chromosome. Oh, that's what I got that from. Okay. You get the idea here. Now, when we talk about gender, though, there are around 60 DSD combinations. Okay. Yeah. So when we talk about gender, though, that's a decision that we've made to separate sex from gender. Why? Because the language is arbitrary. It's arbitrary in the sense that we decide, looking at the patterns that are out there in the universe, what we're going to assign categories to. That's a decision that we make. And there's utility. There is utility in separating gender from sex, because the reality is that there are females that don't match, like their brain chemistry, their mental model of themselves and the world around them does not match very well with the pattern that we see for most other females. And the same thing with men. We have men who are born in male bodies. We have men who are born in female bodies. Why? Because the genetics of human beings is incredibly fucking complicated. We got 14,000 or 1,400 different genes. They will form combinations. When you form combinations, you're taking that number and you're multiplying it by itself. Not exactly, but you get the idea. That number actually gets bigger than the 1,400 genes that are in a chromosome. Those genes are interacting with each other, and then they interact with the environment. It's not just 1,400. It's a number way larger than that if you want to actually try to estimate all the different kinds of variations and combinations that are out there. This is not me being exaggeratory. This is not me just being manic right now. I'm telling you, the world is way fucking more complicated than that. That's the reality. We just don't like that reality because it's hard for us to grapple with that as simple fucking human beings. But gender gives us utility as a word distinct from sex, because in reality, we observe that there are phenomena where there are males who exhibit a mental model that is substantially different from the average of other males. So it's not enough for us if our vocabulary only had those two categories. We wouldn't have words to actually describe the real phenomenon that's going on out there. And it is a real phenomenon, by the way. When people think, like, you're born male, you're born female, your brain has to be male or female, it's not entirely accurate, because when you actually study the brain of transgender individuals, okay, number one, hearing them describe themselves that way should tip you off that there's something going on there that's worth exploring, that's worth investigating. Now, you could have the opinion that they're just making shit up, they're just playing a game, whatever it may be, right? But a scientific mind, a critical thinking mind, would want to look at that and go, okay, well, are they actually making shit up, or is there actually some truth here? It should tip you off to explore further. And when we do, when we look at it, there is a biological basis for this that I think a lot of people don't want to ask themselves that question. Like, whenever I have this conversation with people on trans stuff, I ask them this question. This is sometimes the first question I ask them. Where do you think trans comes from? No, like, genuinely, where do you think it comes from? And it feels like sometimes I'm starting to pick away at like a sensitive aspect of themselves where, like, it's almost like and maybe this is just me projecting, but I feel like sometimes when I ask people that question and then I start pushing on that question, I feel like people are like intentionally avoiding actually looking into it because they're afraid of what the answer is, because the answer is going to be different from what they've wanted to believe, what they think, right? Or maybe it's the alternative, which is that maybe people just genuinely don't think about it at all. But if we actually ask that question, where is it coming from? Is there some truth to it? Like, we have been talking about this issue in our pop culture for what, 10, 15, 20, maybe 30 years now? Obviously, it goes back way longer than that, but how long has it been a big mainstream issue in our public conversation? And you're telling me over this decade or two that you're telling me that you think that no one has ever bothered to actually scientifically try to figure out if there's a truth basis to this and what it actually is? And you think that when I ask people, where do you think it comes from? You're telling me that you genuinely think this whole fucking time, you really think that there's no information out there that you could have looked into to find out about this? Do you really think that, or you're hiding from that question? So let's not hide from it. Let's look into it. Let's see, is there research into this? Because there is research into this. What does science, I can't even pronounce science, say about transgender people biologically? All right, in the chat real quick. The way I see it as a trans man is gender is in the brain. The brain tries to match the body, but sometimes it could be in a trans way or intersex way. Yeah, and there's a lot of variation in there, again, because of the way that our genes are. We're talking about like 1,400 genes on a chromosome. And again, those genes are interacting with each other. I don't know that every single gene is interacting with other genes, so I can't make a simple like mathematical calculation here. But like, let's just pretend that they did. That would be, what would that be? Would that be a factorial? I don't know what it would be, but you'd have, I think it would be factorial, right? Yeah, you'd have 14 factorially. I don't think this is actually how it works, but let's just pretend that it is. Because again, I don't think literally every single gene is interacting with every other gene. I just want the number. Give me the number. What is the number? 3.46 times 10 to the 30798. Okay, when you read a number like this is because they don't have enough room to write this number out. What you need to do is basically take this number, take this 3.4, or maybe if it's easier for you, ignore everything past this period. Just take the 3 and add 3,798 zeros behind it, and you get an idea how big the number is. That's how many combinations there would be if all the genes were interacting with each other. So like, understand how much variation, how many different combinations of things there are there. And that's without even getting into the environmental factors that change the way that genes express themselves. In like genetics, there's a concept of epigenetics. In other words, certain genes will activate depending on environmental triggers or factors, and genes will express themselves differently depending on those environments. And we all know that, right? Your parents told you to eat your vegetables so you can grow up to be big and strong. That tells you that there's an environmental component to how your genes will express themselves. So like, there's a lot of variation there. But anyways, getting in here to science indicates transgender identity has a complex biological underpinnings, including genetic, hormonal, and neuro and anatomical factors. Studies suggest brain structures in transgender individuals may align more closely with their gender identity than their birth-assigned sex. It is considered multifactorial trait. Yes, that's basically what I was saying, that there's a lot of factors involved. But like, even the people, sometimes you will tell people this, and they will still say, well, you know, they push back on it still. And basically the response to this should be that, like, here's a question to ask. If somebody genuinely has like a brain anatomy that is supposed to be more reflective of the opposite sex, but their genitalia, so like, let's say that their genitalia is male, they have a penis and a balls, you know, and a balls, you know, 2 balls, sometimes 3. So they have penis and balls. They got, you know, they got the hot dog and the beans or whatever we want to call it. But their brain is the brain of a woman's brain. Here's the question to ask somebody. which do you think is easier? Do you think it's easier to change the brain, or do you think it's easier to change the body? Or maybe another way of asking this question is, which is easier to accommodate, the brain or the body? Now, keep in mind, the human brain is the most complex structure in the entire universe that we're aware of. So let me ask that question again. Which do you think is easier to accommodate, changing the brain or changing the body, or making accommodations for the brain or the body? Like, we don't even have to like wonder about this question. We already know. Gender reassignment surgery is an actual thing. We have it. We know how to do it. It's possible. Hormone procedures are a thing that we have the technology for. We do not have the technology to change someone's fucking brain. Not only that, but like, we don't even actually know everything about the brain at this point. The science that goes, like science of the brain, neurology or psychology, or a combination of those, is probably among the most immature sciences known to mankind, because we just don't know enough and we're constantly learning new things, and it is literally the most complex structure that we know of. So if you have somebody who is transgender, if you can acknowledge that their brain anatomy doesn't match kind of like what a male person with man's, gender, it doesn't match the cis archetype, if you're able to acknowledge that, then it stands to reason that you accommodate the brain. Because in reality, also, the brain is what actually makes the person too. That's a separate argument. These are two different arguments for the same thing. The brain, the mind, is what defines the actual person. And number two, the brain is the most complex structure in the known universe. We can't just change a person's brain, but we can accommodate the brain. We can make changes to the body even. We could treat the body. We can't change the brain. But let's look at the research into the brain when it comes to transgender stuff. Okay, hold on before we move forward in chat. So Kai says, you are nearing the difficult question. Can transgenderism emerge from both environment and biological factors? Yeah, and I mean, the reality is this is an even more deeper and fundamental question, which is that gender, the way that we, again, because of our language and stuff, the way that we even think of gender, man and woman, it's not that simple. There are no two men that are the same. There are men who are more aggressive. There are men who are more docile. There are men who are more noble. There are men who are more savage. There are men who are smarter than other men. There are men who are more neurotic. Same thing with women, right? What does it even mean when we say man and woman? We're talking about a simplified pattern for what in reality is like a continuum of different personalities. And what the fuck is personality? Personality is not even like, I don't even think that's a one-dimensional thing. I don't know how many dimensions there are to personality. There are personality tests out there. They're like the Big Five. The Big Five basically has 5 dimensions, but I don't think the Big Five even captures it either. So like, you're right. But I think it's even deeper than that, which is that what makes somebody transgender versus, cisgender? There's probably a bit of a continuum between those things, more so than we're kind of at that our society's ready to acknowledge and accept yet. But shit, I'm trying to get people to just acknowledge kind of like the level 1 stuff first. Okay, let's look at this. Study reveals potential biological basis for transgender, neurobiology of transgender individuals and sexual orientation from PubMed. Okay, let's start with this one. A new study has uncovered a link between being transgender and changes in genes that process the sex hormone estrogen and androgen, revealing a possible biological basis for gender dysphoria. Scientists at Hudson Institute of Medical Research, Melbourne, analyzed data from 380 transgender women, male to female transgender people, and found that certain versions of 12 different genes were significantly overrepresented in transgender women compared to non-transgender males. Quote, this is the world's largest and most comprehensive study examining changes in genes that control sex hormone signaling in transgender women. So like, one of the issues that we've had with the research on trans individuals is because there's such a small percentage of the population, it's been hard to get studies with a large enough population size to really feel confident about it. So like, for example, what percent of the population is trans? It's approximately 1. This includes about 0.8% of US adults and 3.3%. So it's something around 1, a little bit less than 1, right? The way that Fox News talks about it, it makes it sound like it's like 30% of the population. It's a super small percentage of the population. And of course, like not everybody who's trans is out yet, right? They're on a journey of self-discovery themselves, or maybe they don't want to participate in these studies because they're part of a group that is, maligned for their identity. So it's been hard to get good, large-scale representative samples, but 380 is probably a pretty good number. So, and anyways, so we're getting to a point now where we're starting to have enough research to really start diving into what's actually going on here. Anyways, so going back to this quote here, it identifies several new genes or genetic variations never before looked at in gender dysphoria. Lead author Professor Vincent Harley of Hudson Institute said, international collaboration. Okay, I'm going to skim here. Genetic variations identified. The team looked specifically at transgender women or people assigned male at birth who later take steps to affirm their gender identity as female through cross-hormone treatment and surgery. They identified variations in a handful of genes which are involved in a pathway that processes estrogen and androgen, including testosterone, the male and female sex hormones. Now, sometimes when you bring up this argument that, it's a genetic manifestation, that there's a biological basis to this, that transgender people aren't making it up, that there's a biological reality to it, right? Some of the counter arguments from some of the more, assholey type of individuals will be, well, then they have a mental illness, they're defective, they're abomination, so on and so forth, right? Now, when they say that, they're revealing something about themselves. They're revealing that their opposition to trans people isn't just on the basis of facts or stats or logic or, the fact of the matter or reality. When you start mocking somebody who you think has if you think that they have a mental disability, right? Their words, not mine. But when you start mocking that, when you start trying to put those people down, when your goal isn't to accommodate those people, you are not saying that you think that they have a mental disability simply because you're stating facts. You're doing that in order to put that person down. When we have people who are paraplegic, for example, we don't take those people and go, oh, look at you, you're a useless human being, you're a piece of shit, fuck off, good luck, right? No, we build handicap ramps for them. We build wheelchairs for them. We don't treat them like they're people to be bullied, to be thrown under the bus, to be discarded. We are people, we're a civilization that takes care of other people, that sees that a person might be different. A person may even have, challenges. Everybody has a challenge, honestly. Everybody has their own demons that they fight. Not all of it is physical. Not all of it is mental, right? People have different things they're going through. We don't just look at people and say, oh, you're different. You have some sort of issue. You're bad. I hate you. Fuck you. I'm going to subjugate you. I'm going to bully you. I'm going to harass you. We don't do that. But, right? Although that said, there is actually a biological basis for transgenderism. So anyways, reading further here, quote, we propose these genetic variations could make some males less able to process androgen, causing the brain to develop differently, with areas that are less masculine or more feminine. And notice that when they use these terms here, they are in, this wouldn't be what, quotation marks? I forget what this is called. But the reason that this scientist is saying that is because they're hedging here. They recognize even that calling these areas of the brain more masculine or feminine, these are like highly inaccurate statements. They don't really reflect what's actually going on chemically or physically. These are ways that communicate to like a layperson, to a general audience, kind of like an abstract idea of what we're trying to get at. But in reality, like what even does it mean for a brain to be more masculine or be more feminine? There's probably elements of your brain that are more masculine or more feminine. And sometimes there's a lot that's shared in between, and it's probably more of a gradient more than anything. So that's why he's using kind of like quotations here, because these really aren't scientifically accurate. You got to take them with a bit of a grain of salt. As humanity advances, as we learn more about the brain, we're going to start to realize that these categories that we've given to things are they're holding us back to a certain degree from really understanding the full breadth of what's actually going on. Anyways, quote, which may contribute to gender dysphoria in transgender women. Broader impact and acceptance. Okay, now let's go to this next article here. Let me see if we got anything in chat. All right, so Kai says, back in the 90s, we said sex change and transsexual, but since transgender came out, it's confused the issue. That's why so many see drag queens trans or crossdressers trans. Yeah, you know what's interesting is that a few years back, I actually asked a few friends of mine this question, and these friends of mine are a little bit more in the LGBT community. I'm a straight dude. I'm like a heteronormative dude. I like a lot of traditionally masculine things, but like I like feminine things too. Shit, I like plants. All right, I want to water plants and shit. I know that's like tree huggy and woo, right? But I don't care. I like it. Fuck you. But here's the thing. I have never felt, and I find it weird sometimes when you have like heterosexual men that get offended by this. Why do so many heterosexual men get super fucking butthurt over the existence of like feminine men, femboys? Why do they get butthurt over transgender people? My masculinity has never been affected by you, has never been affected by the existence of a trans person. There is something deeply insecure about that kind of response. But anyways, let's continue on. Oh, that's what I was gonna say is that, so I asked my LGBT friends, like, and this was a genuine question. Sometimes people conflate transsexual and transgender because they're trying to be an asshole. Basically, if you don't know, transsexual is a passé term. It's a term that we don't use anymore. It's considered a bit of a slur. If I understand correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, Kai. The correct term is transgender. And you might be asking the question, why don't we use transsexual anymore? It's because they're not actually transsexual. They're like, we're acknowledging that their sex is male or female. It's that the gender, the mind is the thing that's different, right? And so that's why, but like I asked the question, and it's important too to recognize when people are asking the question in good faith and understand that there's a lot of people out there. I'm somebody who's been around LGBT communities for a long time. I had to ask that question and I didn't know about it. So imagine the broader populace out there of like general public, they don't know what these things are very well. And so you have to understand that some of these people, they are going to ask it in good faith. They don't mean to necessarily be transgressive, to use another trans word. They don't mean to be offensive and all that. Now, some people do mean to be an asshole, right? But understand that we are in an era where there are a lot of people who are still new to this. And it's on us to try to communicate and help people understand. And if we can get the public to understand better what's going on here, I think that understanding will help shift the needle on these issues. Okay, so Froggon says, actually transsexual became less popular as it was seen as elitist. No one sees it as a slur, but it was taken away because it was gate-kept from non-passing trans people. Okay, interesting. I didn't really know that history. So, I appreciate the trans people I have in chat. Of course, I'm a heterosexual person here speaking on your guys' behalf, but yeah, I appreciate you guys' input. Anyways, let's move on. Let's read this article here. This is from the National Library of Medicine's NIH. Isn't the NIH? This is American official website. What's the other one? The English one is what? The NH English National Medical Association. What is it called? This is kind of tangential, but I just want to know. British Medical. I thought there was a different thing. What is their universal health? English Universal Healthcare System. I thought that was called the NIH. Am I tripping balls? The NHS. Okay, my bad. All right. So here's an article, The Neurobiology of Transgender Identity and Sexual Orientation by C.E. Roselli. All right. So abstract. Sexual identity and sexual... And by the way, if you've never read like academic papers and everything, I don't want to... Academia should not be gate kept. And so I just want to, inform people, like, this information is accessible to you. When you read a paper like this, the abstract it's a summary. I don't know why they say abstract. It's because they're highfalutin and full of bullshit. I'm sure this word means something in some definition, right? But like, I wish they would just make these things easier to read. Like, just call it a summary. But that's what this is. It's basically a summary of what we're going to read. So sexual identity and sexual orientation, it's like a summary / introduction. Sexual identity and sexual orientation are independent components of a person's sexual identity. These dimensions, don't you love that sentence? Sexual identity is a component of a person's sexual identity. Scientists aren't always the most, they're not the best writers, okay? Anyways, these dimensions are most often in harmony with each other and with an individual's genital sex, although not always. The present review discusses the relationship of sexual identity and sexual orientation to prenatal factors that act to shape the development of the brain and the expression of sexual behaviors in animals and humans. Our major influence discussed relates to organizational effects that the early hormone environment exerts on both gender identity and sexual orientation. So, epigenetics, your genes are expressed in an environment. And the environment in this case they're talking about is in utero, in the womb. That the fetus, whatever you want to call it, is in an environment that's feeding it nutrients and hormones and whatnot, right? And that's going to influence its development. The effects early hormone development exerts on both gender identity and sexual orientation. Evidence that gender identity and sexual orientation are masculinized by prenatal exposure to testosterone and feminized in its absence is drawn from basic research in animals, correlations of biometric indices of androgen exposure, and studies of clinical conditions associated with disorders in sexual development. There are, however, important exceptions to this theory that have yet to be resolved. Family and twin studies indicate that genes play a role, although no specific candidate genes have been identified. Evidence that relates to the number of older brothers implicates maternal immune response as a contributing factor for male sexual orientation. So if you don't know, there's some other studies that have shown that I think the second born son is more likely to be gay than the firstborn son. And so there's something going on there from like a biological level, right? But that's a whole topic for another day. Probably pretty interesting research to look into, but it's a different subject. Before I move on here, let's see what the comment says here. Frog Gone. Oh, there's some arguments in chat here. I'm not sure here. Was originally meant to differentiate. Okay, all right. I'll let you guys argue amongst yourselves on that. Okay. Nonetheless, despite the many challenges to research in this area, existing empirical evidence makes it clear that there is a significant biological contribution to development of an individual's sexual orientation and sexual identity and sexual orientation. Introduction. Gender identity and sexual orientation are fundamental independent characteristics of it. Thank you for reiterating yourself. This is also, when I was in college, I hated this about writing research papers. I felt like there's so much research compiled in a given year in all the different branches of science, but it's like buried away in redundant format, the formatting of research papers that I think that, if I could snap my finger and I was like the great dictator of science, I'd be like, all right, we are streamlining the way that we write research papers to get to the goddamn point and stop with all this superfluous language. But anyways, gender identity refers to a person's innermost concept of self as male, female, or something else, and can be the same or different from one's physical sex. Now, I don't really like this because maybe you guys can correct me if I'm wrong. I don't feel like we're talking about it's a person's innermost concept of the self as male, female, or something else. I feel like it's their concept of whether they're man or woman or something else. Again, like the gender versus sex distinction. And I feel like they don't mean to, I'm sure they mean well here, but this contributes to the confusion and the conflation that the general public probably has over sex versus gender. All right. Sexual orientation refers to an enduring pattern of emotional, romantic, and or sexual attractions to men, women, or both sexes. Both gender identity and sexual orientation are characterized by obvious sex differences. Most genetic females identify as such and are attracted to males, androphilic, and most genetic males identify as males and are attracted to females, gynophilic. The existence of these dramatic sex differences suggests that gonadal hormones, particularly testosterone, might be involved. Given that testosterone plays an important role in the development of most behavioral sex differences in other species. Here, a review is provided of the evidence that testosterone influences human gender identity and sexual orientation. The review begins by summarizing the available information on sex hormones and brain development in other species that forms the underpinnings of the hypothesis suggested that these human behaviors are programmed by the prenatal hormone environment, and it will also consider contributions from genes. This is followed by a critical evaluation of the evidence in humans and relevant animals models that relates to sexual identity and sexual orientation to influence that genes and hormones have over brain development. Okay. So like we get the idea here. I don't want to get too bogged down into the details of these things because I honestly just don't even think it's all that important. I think that the reality is that the general public isn't even aware that this is even a thing, let alone the details. The details probably aren't all that important. The top line thing to the general public is probably the most important part, which is that does the general public, if I were to ask you guys, what do you guys think? All right, I'll put a poll in chat. I never get engagement from you guys. Maybe I'll get engagement this time. Do you think a majority of the general public is aware that transgenderism is the result of biological, genetic and environmental factors in utero that causes a transgender person to be born that way? Yes or no? I'm going to ask this question. General public aware that there's a biological basis for the development of gender, including trans? Comments too long. Is the, here, I'll take general. Oh, is the public. All right. Quickly, let's see what we got in chat. So, okay, so people are, they're arguing in chat. But yeah, so the public isn't even aware of like the top line aspect of this, I don't think. And so like, before we even get into all the details, like, man, we should just start with like the basics, that the general public isn't even aware that there is a biological basis for transgenderism, and it's due to the brain. They don't even know that part. I feel like they don't know that part. It's due to the brain, and it's due to genetic and environmental factors in utero that affect brain development. So what I wanted to look at next was patterns in brain of trans people. I'm aware that there's some research into this. Brain sex in transgender women is shifted towards gender identity. All right. So, abstract. Let's cite the authors. Let's give them some credit. They probably worked hard on this. Florian Kurth, Christian Gasser, Francisco J. Sanchez, and Eileen Luders. Abstract. Transgender people report discomfort with their brain or their birth sex and a strong identification with the opposite sex. The current study was designed to shed further light on the question of whether the brain of transgender people resembles their birth sex or their gender identity. For this purpose, we analyzed a sample of 24 trans men, 24 cisgender men, 24 cisgender women, and 24 transgender women before gender-affirming hormone therapy. We employed a recently developed multivariate classifier that yields a continuous probabilistic rather than binary estimate for brains to be male or female. Now, one thing that I noticed here, when they said they're using 24 transgender men, 24 transgender women, and they're using 24 cis men, cis women, and then 24 transgender women before gender-affirming hormone therapy. Why is that? This is a scientific control. What they're trying to test here is they're trying to see, is there a natural basis for all this? But if the person that they were testing was undergoing hormone therapy, it would introduce an external factor into the results. So they just want to see, before there's any intervention of human technology or hormones or anything else, is there just something naturally different going on between these different individuals? We employed a multivariate classifier that yields a continuous probabilistic rather than binary. So what they mean by this is, rather than giving results that are like male or female, it's going to be like a continuum with male and female, male and female. I think man or woman, or masculine versus feminine is probably more accurate. But you get the idea, is like your results aren't going to be either this or this. It's going to be anywhere along that line. anywhere along that gradient. So that's what they mean by it. The results give a continuous probabilistic estimate. And then it's multivariate, meaning that they're probably testing different questions, different factors that will contribute to that score. That's my understanding of this. The brains of trans women range between cisgender men and cis women, albeit still closer to cis men, and the difference to both cisgender men and cisgender women were significant. P equals 0.016 and P is less than 0.001 respectively. These findings add support to the notion that the underlying brain anatomy in transgender individuals is shifted away from their biological sex towards their gender identity. So in other words, if you take two males, one of those males is a cis male. In other words, they're a male who identifies as a man. They're heteronormative. They're like me. They're what most people consider just like the default, right? You are a male, you're a man. If you take two males, one is that kind of man, or that kind of male, and then you take another male who identifies as a woman, right? What you'll find if you look at their patterns of, when we analyze the sample question, we had a light question on the questions of whether brains, so they develop multiple. So we're not sure yet. We need to dive into this a little bit more. What do these multivariate classifiers mean? But the point is that when they applied these multivariate classifiers to try to figure out, what they find is that the male who identifies as a woman, their classifiers are shifted more towards what the average is for cisgender women. So females who identify as women, your heteronormative, typical default kind of understanding of what a woman is, that old conventional class, whatever. What they find is that the transgender woman, a male who identifies as a woman, their pattern is shifted away from what the average is for your typical male, and it's shifted more towards the female pattern. So there is something going on there, right? Okay, introduction. Let me see what we got in the chat. I do not have a connection to the community. Did you? Okay, so we got some back and forth there. I'll leave you guys to it. All right, so we'll end this poll. How many responses do we get? 3, okay. You guys know you don't have to agree with me, right? Anyways. Introduction. Transgender people report discomfort with their birth sex and a strong identification with the opposite sex. Transgender women are assigned male at birth, but identify as female. Transgender men are assigned female at birth, but identify as male. Worldwide, the report, let me ask you guys in the chat here, the two trans people I have here, because I always feel like they're getting this wrong. Do you guys identify as the opposite sex, or you identify as man or woman? Because I feel like they're always not really stating this correctly, right? Because we acknowledge the sex and gender distinction, no? And so I feel like the way this should be worded is, like, if you are born male, but you identify as a woman, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. Okay, so worldwide, the reported prevalence of transgender identities is rising, but our scientific understanding of how gender identity develops is still limited. Okay, so when we see that the rate of identifying as transgender is increasing, there's a question of what's causing that, right? Now, the right wing likes to push this narrative of, oh, it's a social contagion. In other words, it's a trend, or people are being indoctrinated into it, or they're getting socialized brownie points for doing this. But alternatively, it's possible that the environment is changing such that the in utero development of fetuses are, like, we're seeing more transgender individuals develop as a result of environmental changes to the world that we live in. There could be a variety of factors that are causing that. Believe it or not, it doesn't just have to be like chemicals. It doesn't have to just be like what we eat, what we consume, the air, the microplastics, all that kind of stuff. It could genuinely be like cultural, social, influences, because those things will affect the mother's body and anatomy. Like, for example, stress, right? Stress is something, it's not like a chemical. I mean, there is a chemical associated with it, but stress is not like a cheeseburger or fries or microplastics, right? You think of it as a psychological thing, but stress will affect your body. It will cause you to become more lethargic. You know, it'll cause you to maybe you'll have stress in the tension in your musculature, right, as a result. So it could be all just like chemical factors that are changing the environment that causes more women to have develop fetuses that are transgender. It could be that there are like social psychological influences in the environment that are causing changes to the way that the woman's anatomy is developing a fetus. But here's the other option. It could be that there have always been more transgender individuals than we estimated in the past, but because they were bullied and harassed and killed, less of them were willing to identify as transgender, versus because it's less stigmatized now, because it's a little bit more normalized now, the same proportion of people in the population are transgender, but they're just more willing to answer questions in surveys and stuff, identifying that they are, right? It doesn't, when the right says it's a social contagion, there's actually a lot of other explanations that they're not giving credence to. Anyways, so social explanations pointing to psychosocial and environmental influences are complemented. So when they have these numbers here in these brackets, that means that they are referencing another paper, article, or research that they're looking at. So this one comes from The Origins of Sex Differences in Human Behavior, Evolved Dispositions versus Social Roles. So this is a study that looks at like when you, not even talking about like transgender stuff, but just like the differences in human behavior between men and women. Like what causes that? There's environmental factors, there's genetic factors. This is a study that looked at those things. So the authors of this paper are referencing that study, right? So social explanations pointing to psychosocial and environmental influences are complemented by biological explanations that include genetic predisposition and hormone exposures. And now they're citing other research. I'm sure this research is research that talks about genetic influences on the way that men and women, identify and express themselves. So in other words, we already have research and data going back in previous years that looks at when you take men and women, what causes them to be men and women. There's a combination of environmental and genetic factors. So now we're just taking that information and we're expanding it now to try to understand what is the cause of transgender individuals with that information. Some, or perhaps all, of the aforementioned variables may have contributed to neuroanatomical variations in transgender brains, as repeatedly observed in both post-mortem and in vivo studies. So in other words, they've looked at the brains of transgender people. Post-mortem means after they're already dead. And there are studies that look at them while they're alive. Those studies, obviously, they can't crack someone's head open and do an autopsy on their brain. So they're probably doing things like MRIs to see brain activity in different regions of the brain and whatnot. Maybe take measurements using, brain imaging. I think they do C scans as well for the brain. So stuff like that. Let's see if we got anything in chat. Okay, moving on. So, and here they're citing a lot of research on these topics. So you can see there's a fuck ton of research into questions of this nature that the media just does not talk about at all. Nobody talks about it. We pretend like there isn't robust research into this. There is. Nobody talks about it. I'm not obviously I don't have the time to look at every one of these studies, but let's just look at the titles to get an idea of what we're looking at. So this one is called Regional Gray Matter, Variation in Male to Female Transsexualism. So they've looked at like the volume of gray matter in transgender individuals versus, male, your cisgender males and females. So volumetric differences, sex dimorphism of the brain in male to female transsexuals, cerebrum and in the cortex. So looking at specific regions of the brain. Cortical thickness in untreated transsexuals, cerebrum and cortex. Okay. Transgender research in the 21st century, a selective critical review of cognitive perspective. This one might be interesting because a critical review is where you look at like the other research that's already out there, and you basically kind of like do a summary and analysis of like, you know, collecting all the different research that's been out there. Let me kind of try to like put all that together and summarize it. So I don't want to read every individual study, but that one might be a good kind of like overview. So we'll check this one out. Okay, we have a meta-analytical findings from Enigma Transgender Persons Working Group. This is another one where it's going to be like a summary of other data or other research. So we'll look at that one as well. We have this one here. So like I said, MRI, circulating androgens correlate with resting state MRI in transgender men. So they looked at, okay, this hormone androgen, right? Am I understanding this correctly? Androgen's a hormone. Androgen versus like estrogen and testosterone. It's a sex hormone, yeah. So they're looking at like the circulation of that hormone in the brain using MRI scans, and they're looking at it in transgender individuals. And I would assume that they're probably comparing that to androgen circulation in male, you know, cisgender male, cis women, you know, females and whatnot, and using that as a way to look at the biology. Okay. 16 here. Male to female transsexuals show sex atypical hypothalamus activation when smelling odorous steroids. Interesting. Structural connections in the brain in relation to gender identity and sexual orientation. Anatomical and functional findings in female to male transsexuals. 19. Predicting outcomes of cross-sex hormone therapy in transgender individuals with gender incongruence based on pre-therapy resting state brain connectivity. Sexual differentiation of human brain in relation to gender identity and sexual orientation. Cortical gyrification in transgender individuals. A sex difference in the human brain and its relation to transsexuality. Regional gray matter structure, differences between transsexual and healthy controls. A vulval-based morphometry study. Keep in mind, some of these are old, so some of the terminology might be outdated. So you'll notice a lot of these say like transsexual versus transgender. It's because some of these studies might be older. Increased cortical thickness in male to female transsexualism. A review of status of brain structure research in transsexualism. White matter microstructure in female to male transsexuals before cross-sex hormone treatment. Brain network interconnections or interactions in transgender individuals with gender incongruence. And male to female transsexuals have female neuron numbers in limbic nucleus. Interesting. I'm curious what this one's about. All right, give me a quick second. I need to blow my nose. I'll be right back. Hold on. Again, guys, please like, share, and subscribe if you like this kind of stuff. Anyways, let's move on. All right. However, despite this wealth of research, a clear consensus is still missing in terms of which brain structures are altered in transgender individuals. Possible reasons include analyzing small and or heterogeneous samples. Heterogeneous means like the samples. A sample just means like things that you're looking at in a study. So heterogeneous means that the samples are different. Homogeneous would mean like they're the same samples. So possible reasons include analyzing small or and or heterogeneous samples, applying different morphometric methods. I'm not sure what this means. We could look at like the word origins of these terms. Morpho meaning change, and then metric meaning like a measurement of that change, I think. Morphometrics is the quantitative analysis of biological form encompassing the measurement of size and shape variation in organisms, organs, or geographical features. Okay, I think I had morpho wrong. It's good to know the word origins. Okay, I don't want to know which is bright blue iridescent wheat, native to the central. Okay, that's not what I'm looking for. Modern Latin from Greek morpho, an epithet of Aphrodite. It means form or shape or structure. Okay, so this is something that's measuring like shapes and structures. So applying different morphometrics methods across studies as well as focusing on single brain features. The latter is a concern in particular, as even within cisgender studies, there are large discrepancies in terms of reported sex differences, apart from the larger male and smaller female brains on average. So in other words, this is what we were talking about earlier, that even looking at studies that just talk about like your cisgender men, cisgender women, even among males in those populations, there's large discrepancies among those, like from male to male, there's differences in like the different things that they were measuring, right? A possible solution is to study brain patterns rather than single features, as lately accomplished using modern machine learning algorithms in both cisgender samples and transgender samples. So this study is multivariate revisit to sex beyond the genitalia. Anderson, Herensky, machine learning of brain gray matter differentiates sex in a large forensic sample. Patterns in the human brain mosaic discriminate males from females. Oh, patterns in the human brain mosaic discriminate males from females. Establishing a link between sex-related differences in structural connections of behavior. So in other words, if you give a computer or machine that's been trained on how to spot differences, you give them two different brains, they can tell you which one's a male brain versus a female brain based on certain kinds of either like electrochemical patterns in the brain or different kind of like shapes and structures in the brain that have differences between your average male, average female. Development of sex differences in the brain. So this one's probably looking at like the difference between male and female brain anatomy. Not just that they're different, but like how do those developments happen? I guess like as you're a fetus and maybe as you're growing. And then for transgender samples, we have regional volumes and spatial volumetric distributions of gray matter in the gender dysphoric brain. Biological sex classification with structural MRI data shows increased misclassification in transgender women. A multivariate pattern analysis of sex and gender-related neuroanatomical differences in cis and transgender individuals using structural magnetic resonance imaging. MRI, that's what that word means. Predictive pattern classification can distinguish gender identity subtypes from behavior in brain imaging. Okay. The overarching question addressed in those recent studies is whether the brains of transgender people are concordant with their birth sex or their gender identity. So I think concordant here means, we use context clues like, does it align with their birth sex or does it align with their gender identity? So what they're trying to ask here is, when we actually study the brain, does it reflect like what we typically expect from their sex, like male or female? Or does it actually reflect what they're saying is their gender identity? What is the truth of the like what the brain physically looks like? Oh, sorry. And then this next sentence, like the process of doing that is usually based on a so-called classification accuracy. For example, or not for example, but in other words, how well can a brain be classified as male or as female? But again, they referenced all this research in the past that's been done on like building models that are able to distinguish a male brain from a typical female brain. So because we have research into that specific topic, we're able to use that information now in order to then inform how we look at transgender individuals' brains and compare it to that, right? Interestingly, some studies, 36 and 37, Biological sex classification with structural MRI data shows increased misclassification in transgender women. Okay, and then this one. A multivariate pattern analysis of sex and gender-related neuroanatomical differences in cis and transgender individuals using structural magnetic... Okay. Interestingly, some studies reported that the classification accuracy was reduced in transgender individuals, albeit not all studies observe this effect. The reason for divergence in study outcomes may be due to including individuals at different points in their gender-affirming process, using univariate classifiers, and or applying binary classifiers, contrary to the notion that a mere binary classification may be insufficient to capture interactions between biological sex and gender identity. So in other words, some of these other studies that had inaccurate results, it might have been the result of them using a test that only gives you either male or female as the answer at the end. And that what that test wouldn't do is it wouldn't give you like all of the variation in between those two discrete ends. And that like a research or a test that was done that has more variation, has more like options in the middle of that, will give you like a broader, more complete understanding, basically. The current study was designed to shed further light on the question of whether the brain of transgender people resembles their birth sex or their gender identity. For this purpose, we employed a recently developed multivariable classifier. Okay, so they got this classifier from another study. Development of sex differences in human brains, okay? That yields a continuous rather than a binary estimate for being male or female, in accordance with current biological models. 5 questions for the next 50 years. Oh, sex differentiation of brain and other tissues. Reframing sexual differentiation of the brain. So, based on more recent research into the brain differences between males and females, they used the more recent, more up-to-date information in order to build a better multivariate classifier for the research that they're doing in this particular study. Our study sample size consisted of 24 cis men, 24 cis women, and 24 transgender women before hormone therapy in order to rule out any modifying effects of circulating sex steroids. See what I was saying earlier, that they tested people before they underwent hormone therapy so that they could rule out any sort of effects related to like steroids, like any drugs or chemicals. We hypothesized, in other words, a hypothesis is like an educated guess, right? So they're hypothesizing before they run the test, and then they want to see what are the results at the end. Did the results match their educated guess? We hypothesize that the estimated brain sex in transgender women is shifted away from their biological sex towards their gender identity, but still significantly different from both. All right, so participants. 24 transgender women were recruited through local community organizations. Okay, I want to skim through this. I want to read the whole thing. Moreover, participants were confirmed to be genetic males as defined by the presence of a SRY gene in their genome. My understanding is this particular gene, the SRY gene, will like trigger male adaptation in the womb or something along those lines. But, you know, important, like these are like small details that we don't really care about, but basically like when you're running a research paper, you have to point out like how you did everything. And so first of all, they need to test, like, let's make sure like we have males, we have females, you know, we have to make sure we rule that out, that there's no like, you know, somebody could come along and be like, wait a second, you did this whole test and survey, but did you actually check to make sure they were like genetically male or oh, we didn't do that. Oh, well then your study's trash, right? They have to make sure they cover all their bases. 6 transgender women reported to be androphile, attracted to men, and 18 transgender women stated to be gynophile, attracted to women. The mean age of transgender sample was 45.7 plus or minus 13.8 years, so a range of 23 to 72 years. The cisgender sample selected from the International Consortium of Brain Mapping database was close in age and handedness and consisted of 24 males. So hold on a second. The cisgender samples, okay. And 24 females. So they picked So they had their transgender population had this age range, and it was close to the same age range for the sample of males and the sample of cisgender females, which is good because you want the samples to be pretty analogous, right? You want to be comparing apples to apples. All participants provided informed consent, and ethics approved was granted by the International Review Board of University of California at Los Angeles and the University of Auckland. All brain images were acquired on the same 1.5 Tesla MRI system. Why would you do that? Because what you want to roll out is someone might say, oh, you used 2 different MRI machines or 3 different MRI machines. How do you know that the differences between these groups isn't because one machine is not calibrated the same as the other machine, or this machine's more sensitive? No, we use the same machine for all of the tests. So we're rolling that out as being a factor. Using a T1 weighted sequence with the following parameters. TR is 1900 milliseconds, or is that milliseconds? TE equals, okay, I don't know what this stuff is. This is probably how you calibrate like an MRI machine, I guess. Brain images were processed using SPM8 and the VBM8 toolbox as previously described. Okay, so they used those multivariate, I think that's what these are, these multivariate, what was it, criteria? What do they call it? Multivariate classifiers. So like they took the imaging of the brains and then they used that to like these specific, actually let's look this up real fast. Let's see what this takes us to. Oh no, it's 404 page. Statistical parametric mapping refers to the construction assessment of spatially extended statistical process using the tested hypothesis about functional imaging data. All right. Oh, okay. Maybe I got this wrong. I think maybe there's just the software that they used. But they're using the same software as was used in these other studies that they pulled their multivariate classifiers from. So they wanted to compare apples to apples. In short, all brain images were tissue classified into gray matter, white matter, cerebrospinal fluid, and the resulting gray and white matter partitions were spatially normalized to M and I space using 12-parameter affine transformations. Jesus Christ. But if I understand this correctly, the data they get from the MRI is able to distinguish gray matter from white matter in the brain. And I think that this might be like some kind of mathematical equation transformation, like space transformation kind of thing to do that. Finally, the normalized tissue segments were smoothed using an 8mm kernel and resampled at 4mm voxel size. These images constituted the input for brain sex estimation. The brain sex classifier was trained on an independent set of MRI images from an adult sample obtained from the IXI database. This training sample comprised brain scans from 547 adults. So basically, they had a larger sample of other adults to train the model on, to, train it to see, okay, this is what your average male looks like, this is what the average female looks like. Then we're going to use that basis, that like metric, that ruler, to compare our individuals, the 24 cisgender men, 24 cisgender women, 24 transgender. We're going to use like the, we're going to compare them against those 547 adults, basically. All images from this training sample underwent the same pre-processing as described above for our current sample, resulting in smooth normalized tissue segments resampled at 4mm voxel size. All right, so more about like the methodology, getting in the weeds here. MATLAB. If you're an engineer, you know what MATLAB is. MATLAB is if you're trying to do some complex mathematical calculations, you can't just use a calculator. You got to basically write like a program to crunch numbers and process data. I've worked with MATLAB before myself for engineering applications, but this makes sense to me. First, the classifier was trained on the aforementioned PCA transform independent training sample, codified females as 0 and males as 1. Then the trained classifier was applied to PCA transform study sample, generating the person-specific brain sex index, a number representing the degree of femaleness/maleness on a continuum. So if like your prototypical female is a 0 and your male is a 1, basically people are going to get a result that's somewhere between there, maybe like 0.1, 0.5, 0.8, whatever it. And depending on what your number is at the end of that, this data processing from the MRI images, it's going to tell you like how close your brain is to like your average male versus your average female. All right. So the individual brains were used to calculate receiver operator characteristic, were used to calculate classify accuracy for main analysis results. The classifier performed at 90.2% accuracy when assessed in the training sample and 88.3% when assessed in our 48 cisgender brains. These measures indicate a suitable classification. So in other words, the like data crunching software program that they used was able to classify a male versus female brain with a 90% accuracy for their training sample, and then 88% accuracy for the 48 people that they were specifically training or studying. And so there's a way to kind of just test, like, okay, does our little algorithm or whatever, is it accurate enough to use as a good test? And it is. Like, these are 90%, 88, almost 90%. These measures indicate a suitable classification, performance, and reliable distinction between the sexes based on brain anatomy. The estimated brain sex index was significantly different between the three groups, with a mean of 1 plus 0.41 in cisgender men and 0.0 plus or minus 0.41 in cisgender women. The brain sex of transgender women was estimated as 0.75 plus or minus 3.9. So in other words, men congregated around this number 1 plus or minus 0.41. Women congregated around 0 plus or minus 0.4. But transgender women were at 0.5, so they were somewhere in the middle. And if you look at this graph, this is a good way of visualizing it. If the average for men were around here, and you see like how this has like a bulbous shape here, this means that you had other measurements for men, for males' brains, that were somewhere around this average, right? Actually, I'm looking at this wrong. Here's 0 right here. This is your prototypical female. Whoever would be over here, -1, this is like hyper female. The hyper male brain's up here. Your average male brain's right here, which again goes to show you, right? When we think about like just regular males versus females, there's overlap. It's not like you have just males all up here in this category where they have no femaleness, and women or female brains are over here with no maleness. Most men and women are actually somewhere, like they have a little bit of overlap with the opposite sex. Because like we share 98% of our genes, right? But when we look at the transgender individuals, look at this. Men are right here. Females are right here. Transgender men are somewhere in the middle here. They do have similarities with the men, but they're also shifted a little bit more to be more in common with the females as well. So there is something going on in the brain there, which shows that there is a difference, and that difference is causing their brain to be shifted more towards the average for the cisgender woman. All right. So you get the idea from this study, right? Let's see what these other studies are talking about. And we'll just skim through. We don't want to dive into these too deeply, but we'll just read like the abstract. So sex differentiation of human brain in relation to gender identity and sexual orientation. Abstract. It is believed that during the intrauterine period of the fetal brain develops in the male direction through a direct action of testosterone on the developing nerve cells, or in female direction through the absence of the hormone surge. According to this concept, our gender identity, the conviction of belonging to the male or female gender, and sexual orientation should be programmed into our brain structures when we are still in the womb. However, since sexual differentiation of the genitals takes place in the first 2 months of pregnancy, and sexual differentiation of the brain starts in the second half of the pregnancy, these two processes can be influenced independently, which may result in transsexual. Oh, this is so important. Do you understand what they're saying here? They're saying that the hormones that are affecting the development of genitals happen at one stage of the pregnancy. The hormonal development, or the hormonal effects that affect the development of the brain gendering anatomy, that happens at a different stage in the pregnancy. And this kind of goes to why would it be the case that you have individuals who are born with a male genital anatomy but have like a more female brain anatomy? It's because the development of these two different organs, I guess, are happening at different stages in the pregnancy. And if during the pregnancy, during those two different stages, there's a different hormone environment for each one, that explains why you might have, some variation there. And so why would that happen, right? Like the woman's body is producing hormone and dumping it into the baby, right? For whatever reason. I don't know enough anatomy, but you can imagine there's probably a variety of reasons why she might produce more of a hormone at one stage in the pregnancy and not as much in the other stage of the pregnancy. But this is so important, and I've heard nobody talk about this. No one. I've never heard anybody talk about this. That this is such an important thing. It kind of tells you why. Why would there be their genitals are male, but they have the brain anatomy that's kind of shifted towards the female? Well, it's because the development of these two organs are happening at different stages in the pregnancy. Why isn't the media ever talked about this? These people get paid millions of dollars, and they can't bother to bring this up in a conversation around this. They don't have people they can pay for a few hours to go research. They don't have interns that they can have research this. It's malpractice, it's laziness, it's incompetence. Anyways, this also means that in the event of ambiguous sex at birth, the degree of masculinization of the genitals may not reflect the degree of masculinization of the brain. There is no proof that social environment after birth has an effect on gender identity or sexual orientation. Okay, so what they're saying here is that, what this doesn't mean they're not saying here that there is no social environment. What they're not saying here is that we don't know for a fact that the gender identity or the sexual orientation of a person is not affected by their social environment. We don't know that. It could be the case, but what they're saying here is that we don't have any evidence at the moment to say that's the case. But what we do have evidence for is that, again, going back here, we do know, we don't know if there's an effect of socialization or, what the conservatives might call social contagion. We don't know that. We don't have any evidence to suggest that's the case one way or the other. But we do have evidence to show that in utero development of the fetus, there is situations where the female's inner uterine environment is producing more testosterone during one stage versus another. And that probably is going to have an effect on, whether a person winds up being transgender or not. Okay. Data on genetic and hormone independent influences on gender identity are presently divergent and do not provide convincing information about the underlying etiology. Not familiar with this term. Let's look it up. Etiology. Etiology. The cause, set of causes, or manner of causation of a disease or condition. Okay. To what extent fetal programming may determine sexual orientation is also a matter of discussion. A number of studies show patterns of sex atypical cerebral dimorphism in homosexual subjects. Although the crucial question, namely how such complex functions as sexual orientation and identity are processed in the brain, remains unanswered, emerging data point at a key role of specific neuronal circuits involving the hypothalamus. So in other words, there's a lot more research to be done. We don't have a full 100% complete picture of how all this works. But what we are saying is that what we do know now is that women will produce different hormone environments in their uterus when a baby's developing, and that may be a factor. it stands to reason that that's probably a factor. We know that that kind of hormone environment is a thing that happens. We don't know about all the rest of this stuff. We know about social environment. We do know that in the uterus, the hormone environment, it does, in some situations, change. All right? Moving on. Male to female transsexuals have female neuron numbers in a limbic nucleus. Transsexuals experience themselves as being of the opposite sex, despite having the biological characteristics of one sex. A crucial question resulting from a previous brain study in male to female transsexuals was whether the reported difference according to gender identity in the central part of the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis. In another lifetime, I would have studied neurology, but we don't live in that lifetime. The stria terminalis is a major C-shaped white matter bundle acting as the primary output pathway of the amygdala. Which one was it? The stria terminus? So it's this guy right here. The central part of the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis was based on a neuronal difference in the BST itself, or just a reflection of the difference in vasoactive intestinal polypeptide innervation. Okay. Vasoactive, I believe that's like blood flow, right? Drugs or substances that modulate blood vessel diameter. So a reflection of differences in the blood vessel diameter in intestinal polypeptide. Polypeptide's a particular kind of chemical, right? A linear chain of multiple amino acids. Innervation. Innervation is the distribution or supply of nerves to a specific body part. Okay, so what we're saying here is it caused by the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis itself, or is it just the difference in the activity of the blood vessels, the blood vessels as it relates to the amino acid chemical chains that form like the distribution of nerve cells? A little bit complicated. From the amygdala, which was used as a marker. Therefore, we determined in 42 subjects the number of somatostatin, somatostatin expressing neurons in the BST in relation to sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, and past or present hormonal status. Regardless of sexual orientation, men had almost twice as many somatostatin neurons as women. The number of neurons in the BST of male to female transsexuals was similar to that of females. Interesting. So you see here in one specific anatomical feature of the brain, we see here that that specific feature in transgender women is much closer to the female, right? So there's a lot of implications to this, and take for granted, a lot of this is going over my head. There's a lot of terminology here I'm not familiar with, but what I'm gathering from this here is that, number one, this specific region of the brain may account for why transgender women are, feel like women, like in the same way that your typical female feels like a woman. But there's a second order implication of this, which might be that this particular region of the brain might have a lot to do with the sense of an identity of a man versus a woman. There's a variety of different biological differences between males and females, but the specific biological differences that cause like a sense of identity as a man or a woman, a lot of it might have to do with this particular structure in the brain. Interesting. The number of neurons in the BSTC of male to female okay, we already read that. In contrast, the neuron number of a female to male transsexual was found to be in the range of the male. Wow. This is so interesting. Oh my gosh. I'm gonna have to save this and read this later on. Because I feel like we're hitting on something here. We're hitting on something probably really important here. Hormone treatment or sex hormone level variations in adulthood did not seem to have influenced BSTC neuron numbers. Hormone treatment or sex hormone level variations. Interesting. The present findings of some somatostatin neuronal sex differences in the BSTC and its sex reversal in the transsexual brain clearly support the paradigm that in transsexual sexual differentiation of the brain and genitals may go in opposite directions and point to a neurobiological basis for gender identity disorder. Okay. Interesting. So, all right. We'll do these two more, but like I think right now, just off of what we already read, everything we already read blows the fuck out of the water of the conservative narrative around transgenderism. They don't have an answer for this shit. And everything that we've learned here, even just by glancing at some like summaries and abstracts and skimming here, and not even looking at, there's so many studies in this that we're not even looking at. Just off of the little that we've read here, there's so much evidence that points in the direction of there being a biological basis for transgenderism. Not just that we observe like the pattern differences, but we also observe like the biological structural differences. And not just that, but we also have found that there are like there's a mechanical, like there's a mechanism there that we're observing, which is that in utero, the development of your genitalia versus the development of your brain gendering, those happen at different stages, and the hormone profile of the woman's womb, when that baby's developing, may be different during those two different developmental stages. So like there is so much information here that's pointing in the direction of a very solid biological basis for why people are transgender that I've heard no conservative contend with. I've heard no media talk about. This blows the fuck out of their arguments. They're not ready for this. So circling back to the start of this whole video, right? About how do we talk about transgender issues as a political party that's trying to move the ball forward, that's trying to be strategic? One of the things that we should be doing, okay, we don't have to know all the details of this. I know that a lot of this is going to go over the heads of the general public, but we could summarize this to say we have a lot of research on this topic. Transgenderism isn't just our feelings. It's not just a social contagion. No, we have a lot of data and evidence and research that has points to a variety of different ways of measuring biological differences. We know of like structural differences in the brain. We know of developmentally in the baby's development, how their genitalia versus their brain might develop differently. We know all these things. The information's out there. We need to start informing the public, start talking to the public and making the public aware that this isn't just like a social construct. This isn't just our feelings. This isn't just go along, you know, just roll with it. No. The public needs to understand there's a biological basis for this. They don't just choose to be transgender. This is their biological reality. This is how human anatomy works. There needs to be an awareness of that. Once the public starts to have an awareness of this being a thing, it's gonna sow seeds that are gonna grow into an understanding for people that, okay, people are born this way. How do we treat people who are born this way? Well, we can't just treat them like they're making shit up. We can't just treat them like you could choose to be trans or not. You're just giving everybody a hard time. No, they're born this way. How do we deal with it? I think most people, not all of them, I think most regular, sensible people, once they understand that, their impulse is going to be, okay, it's a little bit different. The science is a little bit over my head, but I understand that you were born that way. And so because you were born that way and you can't change that about yourself, we're going to try to respect you and try to accommodate you as much as possible. but it has to start with, you know, a chess game. The pawn is making sure the public is aware of this biological basis. Once the public takes that pawn, then we can move in with the queen or the bishop or the rook or the horse, I forget what the knight. We can move into policy prescriptions that are based off of that understanding. You get what I'm saying here? So that's one way. That's not the whole thing. That's one of the ways that I'd like us to start talking about this topic differently, and the Democratic Party can start talking about it differently, is like, they have way more resources than I have. They have way more connections than I have. Why are they not interfacing with people or having interns go out there and just compile all this research, put it all together, go out there, find it, read it. I want you to make a summary for me, summarize it, and now we start to build talking points out of that summary. And now we start to figure out ways to talk to the public about what this actually is. And when the right asks, what is a woman? We have a much more definite answer of what a woman is. A woman is a person that has a brain that has been gendered in utero in that manner, right? It's not necessarily the same thing as their genitalia, because we know from the research that in utero, your brain might develop more masculinized than your genitalia and vice versa. We know that. We have data on that. We have research on that. That's true. Whether you like it or not, it's not about your feelings. Whether you like it or not, that's true. What is a woman? A woman is somebody, not necessarily with the genitalia, although those things tend to go hand in hand, but their brain certainly is gendered that way from a biological level. That's one of the ways we talk about it. Another way we talk about it is we don't have to focus on transgender people in sports. Okay? It's not popular. It's controversial. There is research on it. We'll briefly glance at it. I'm getting a little bit tired here. I don't want to spend too much time on this. But there's probably not enough to say definitively yet at this point. And also, it's really not the most important topic, the most important point here. What would we rather fight on? If I were to ask a representative sample of transgender people across the entire country, which do you guys rather focus on? Just making sure that the public acknowledges your existence and understands that you're born that way and you can't change it? Or do you want to fight about transgender sports for the next 10 years? Which one would you rather make more progress on? And I think most of them will say, making sure the public at least understands that, like, we are who we are, we can't change it. And when we say that we're transgender, we're not making shit up. Because there's probably an understanding between all these people is that like, if we have to choose one or the other, that one forms the premise for a lot of other things. Like, if you get the public to understand that part, then a lot of the other issues that transgender people deal with, they will, almost like a domino effect. Those other issues, you start to make progress on those other issues, versus if you only make progress on the transgender sports thing, if you spend all of your political capital and time focused on that one, if you don't even have the foundation that people understand that transgender people, like, are a biological reality, you're probably not even going to win this one either, by the way. So, like, maybe you win this one, probably not, but maybe you win this one, but, like, all the other issues related to transgender people, you haven't really made too much progress on those. So we should be focusing. This isn't a matter of, like, giving up on transgender people. This isn't a matter of, like, necessarily even giving up on transgenders in sports. But what do we focus on? Do we focus on what the Republicans want us to focus on? Or do we focus on the one little on this topic, which there's a lot of data and evidence for, and conservatives don't have a good argument against it? And once we start showing that their narrative around transgender people is not accurate, you take the wind out of their sails on a variety of different topics down the line related to trans issues, and you start to build up a strong, very solid foundation for transgender issues, because the public starts to realize that transgender people are biologically real. They don't choose to be that way. They are that way in the same way that you are that way and you are that way. That is strategically, from a top-down view, what we need to focus on. So we pick what specific framings we want to focus on. We focus on making sure the public understands that trans is backed up by the data, by the science, that it's not our feelings, that when people ask, like, what is a woman? It's not them that, you know, the conservatives who ask that question, it's not them who look like the ones who have the facts and the stats and the science on their side and we look like we're floundering. No, we do have the data and the science on our side. You guys don't. Okay? So we talk about that. And I think the other guy was right. We talk about it in terms of fairness. You may not agree with the lifestyle. It may be weird to you, but we live in a country where you get to do what you want to do. Other people get to do what they want to do. And we frame it as we all make a collective decision as a society to respect each other's rights. When I stand up for transgender people and their rights, it's an agreement that all of us, I'm also standing up for your rights to do what you want to do and live your life as you want to live your life. We're all coming together as a society and agreeing to, even if we don't agree with each other's lifestyles, even if we don't like each other, we have to acknowledge and respect our rights as Americans to live our lives the way that we want to live them, as long as we're not hurting the other person. Most people, not your MAGA, you know, hardcore conservatives, most people will agree. I think that you'll be surprised how many moderates and independents will agree with that notion of, okay, I may not understand this trans thing, I may not fully agree with the lifestyle, but what I do agree with is that as an American, the kind of America I want to live in is where we don't all have to agree to have the same lifestyle and agree on the same things, but we all get to have our own freedom and our rights. You sell it on those lines. Okay. All right. Quickly, let's read through this fast. Gender dysphoria describes the psychological distress caused by identifying with a sex opposite to the one assigned at birth. In recent years, much progress has been made in characterizing the needs of transgender persons wishing to transition to the preferred gender, thus helping to optimize care. This critical review of the literature examines their common mental health issues, several individual risk factors for psychiatric comorbidity, and current research on the underlying neurobiology. Prevalence rates of persons identifying as transgender and seeking help with transition have been rising steeply. Okay, anxiety and depression. Okay, so this is about like transgender people and basically like struggles that they may have with different kinds of, like, you know, stress or depression, probably associated with kind of their treatment in society more than anything else. All right, now this one, the neuroanatomy of transgender identity, mega analytical findings. They mean meta or mega? In contrast to cisgender persons, transgender persons identify with a different gender than the one assigned at birth. Although research on the underlying neurobiological transgender persons have been accumulating over the years, neuroimaging studies in the relatively rare population are often based on very small samples, resulting in discrepant findings. Which is fair, yes. We need more data. The data we have so far points in the direction of a biological basis, and we understand why they're like what the potential mechanisms for it would be. But like from a scientific standard, we want more data, and we're getting there. We're not there yet. To examine the neurobiological transgender person in large sample methods using a meta-analytical approach, structural MRI data of 803 non-hormonally treated transgender men and transgender women, cisgender men, males assigned at birth as male gender identity, and cisgender women were analyzed. Structural brain measures, including gray matter volume, cortical surface area, and cortical thickness, results transgender persons differed significantly from cisgender persons with respect to the cortical brain volumes and surface area, but not cortical thickness. Contrasting the four groups, we observed a variety of patterns that not only depend on the direction of gender identity. So in other words, the differences in the brains that we observed, like we observed differences depending on your sex, but we also observed on the brain measure as well as the brain region examined. So we observed differences in the patterns, probably of electrochemical activity, I imagine, between males and females, but we also observed differences in the measurements, like the volume, and differences in different regions of the brains as well. Okay. The outcomes of this large-scale study may provide a normative framework that may become useful in clinical studies. Conclusion: rather than being merely shifted towards either end of the male-female spectrum, transgender persons seem to present with their own unique brain phenotype. So in other words, not only are they shifted to, the male or female on the spectrum, but transgender individuals are unique unto themselves. And probably a deeper truth to all this is that our understanding of male, female, of man or woman, there's probably a lot of phenotypes. There might be an infinite amount of phenotypes with like a variety, like a gradient of different varieties. And what we're trying to do in reality is, again, we're trying to draw discrete boxes of a reality that is a lot more continuous and has a lot more gradient to it than we'd like to admit. We want to think of it as like, okay, male or female. But reality is like there's a lot in the middle. And in reality, it's actually three-dimensional. So people actually fall all over the fucking place within this space. And meanwhile, we're only thinking about it in our language as like two little options. But there's a whole volume of possibilities surrounding it. Okay. Now, very quickly, I don't want to spend too much more time on this. I appreciate you saying that, Frog Gun. If you're not already, please consider subscribing. So let's very quickly. This will be the last thing I think I get out. Actually, there's one more thing, basically a reiteration of what I was saying with respect to how we talk about this going forward. But let's do really quickly. What does here's what I want to ask. Do trans people win at sports at a higher rate? Scientific evidence and data do not support the claim that transgender people win at sports at a higher rate. The reason I wanted to look this up, because there's a variety of research and data into this, but I think this cuts through all the noise and gets right to the point, right? Which is, if we are to believe that transgender people can't compete in sports, right? Like it's a closed book. There's no more discussion to be had, right? If we were to believe that, they're like, okay, they can't compete together because it's unfair. If that was true, we should see that transgender individuals would be winning at a higher rate, but we don't see that. The data doesn't show that. So now look, I'm okay with us pumping the brakes on this particular issue. Number one, because it's just the public isn't there. We need to convince the public more. We need to inform the public more to shift perspectives on this. And you know what? Maybe we need more research. Maybe the research is still insufficient. But what I will say is that this is a good talking point. This is a good argument to start pushing back, to start challenging the premise that there is an unfair advantage. If there was an unfair advantage, then you need to tell me, why is it that the data doesn't show that they're winning at a higher rate? Because those two things are like contradictory. And I bet you anything, no one has an answer to that question, because it's a pretty damning question. If we start putting that question, if we, again, the way that we shift the way we talk about the conversation, if we start pointing that out, we might start to make some inroads on transgender people in sports. This isn't us sidestepping the issue of fairness in sports. This is us directly confronting it and showing you, hey, the data doesn't actually support that they have an unfair advantage. So if you're going to say that they do, if you're so sure of that, you need to nut up or shut up, okay? No evidence of dominance. Extensive research, including a 2024 British Journal of Sports Medicine study. I looked into this in the past, this is why I was familiar with this. I did look at this study. Indicated trans women do not retain a lasting competitive advantage after transitioning in hormone therapy. Now, the caveat is, but it's a fair caveat, and the reality is this is how sports organizations have been handling it over the past couple of years, is they require you to be on hormone therapy for a certain length of time. And the purpose of that is supposed to be like, okay, it changes your hormone profile. So any kind of biological advantage that you might have had because you have like more or less testosterone than the other person, after a certain amount of time being on hormone therapy, those hormone differences shouldn't be different. Okay. So that was the idea there. And when we look at those populations that, you know, they've had their hormone therapy, they met their qualifications or whatever, the amount of time they need to be on it, the data doesn't show that they have an unfair advantage. So it seems like that hormone therapy, okay, it seems that way. Maybe more information will come out in the future, but for now, it seems that way, that seems to be enough to mitigate any kind of unfair advantage that they may or may not have had. Okay, while studies have shown that 12 months of hormone therapy lowering testosterone decreases muscle mass, Some studies suggest that some, but not all, physiological advantages such as bone structure or lung capacity may not be fully eliminated, okay? Not fully eliminated. Doesn't mean that you're not mitigating some of those differences, but it, you know, just to be fair, okay? We're being honest. We don't need to be afraid to be honest, because look at how much progress we've made today on how much data supports our position. But okay, maybe there are some physiological advantages, some, not all of it, but some when it comes to bone structure and lung capacity. But again, going back to a question I had earlier at the beginning of this is, which sport are we talking about? Not all the sports are going to be, you're not going to make it or break it based on bone structure or lung capacity. So for example, maybe Formula One, that may not be a huge issue. Maybe for equestrians, maybe not a huge issue. Maybe for gymnastics. I don't know. I'm throwing shit at the board here, but you get my point, right? Different sports are testing different features of the human body or mind. It's worth asking. And even that, with that said, right, the wording here is fully eliminated, meaning that there is some mitigation, just means that it's not fully mitigated. Okay. How much is it mitigated? Is it significant enough that it doesn't matter, or maybe it does? Okay. Questions to ask. You want to have an honest conversation about it. Now, however, in practical terms, this does not consistently translate to higher win rates. Okay. Bottom line, headline of the story is, we do not see a higher rate of winning for transgender individuals. So this whole narrative, it calls that into question directly. Performance parity. Research has shown that after hormone therapy, the athletic performance of trans women often becomes indistinguishable from that from cisgender women. There you go. Limited data context. There is a lack of widespread comprehensive data on transgender athletes in high school, college, professional sports, often leading to overblown anecdotal or misrepresentative narratives. Now they say this, but I thought this 2024 British Journal study was pretty large, right? Because it says extensive, and I thought I remember reading in the past and it having a pretty large sample size. But okay, let's just take it with a grain of salt for now, right? It's not like we can't do more research in the future. I'm getting a little bit tired because it's getting late, but maybe there is. Maybe we need more research, but you know, let's not take for granted that if we get more research than the other trends that we've seen so far where there isn't a higher win rate, like, let's not take for granted that that's gonna change. It might just wind up reconfirming what we already see in the data. Case-by-case variability. Studies show significant variation among all athletes, and the idea of a universal advantage for transgender women is largely considered unfounded by current scientific consensus. Okay, so you get the idea. So, moral of the story, the conclusion from all this is, no, we do not need to abandon transgender women. Of course not. You know me, I was never going to say that in the first place. All right? Okay, let me get some image on here. I know the slogan might be a little bit meme-worthy, but it is true, right? Transgender women and men, they are humans. They deserve human rights. They are born the way that they're born. We can't just throw them under the bus. No, we're not going to abandon transgender people. Of course not. Okay? With that said, there's a way for us to talk about it. When the right talks about transgender women in sports, that doesn't need to be the hill that we die on. There are more important battles to fight, especially around transgender issues. Not everybody, the majority of the population, like 99% of the population is not transgender, and a lot of people in the country have never met transgender people. Trans issues do not need to be the primary focus of our rhetoric and our politics. The right would like us to focus on it. We don't want to take that bait. We want to cater our messaging, cater our politics to a broad electorate, for sure. We don't have to throw transgender people under the bus to do that. When the right brings up sports, we can say, hey, you know what? It's controversial. I know it's unpopular. More data needs to be done on it. So we are willing to take a little bit of a step back there, wait for more data. But what we will say that you guys don't have a response for is, okay, if you're so sure that transgender women have an advantage at sports over cisgender women, why is it that all of the data so far shows that they don't win at a higher rate? That's the way you need to talk about it on transgender sports. If you want to defend transgender sports, bring up that question. If you do not bring up that question in the context of transgender people in sports, what the fuck are you doing? What are you doing? Why would you not do that? It's right there. It's a slam dunk, okay? We're talking about sports, it's a slam dunk. Use it, okay? We talk about the sports issue that way. We talk about transgender rights as fairness, as we live in a society where I don't have to agree with you if you are Christian. I don't have to agree with you if you're Muslim. I don't have to agree with you if you are conservative or if you're liberal or if you're a left-winger or a right-winger or whatever it may be. I don't have to agree with you if you decide to be promiscuous and date casually. I don't have to agree with you if you say that you should marry your high school sweetheart and have 50 kids. We do not have to agree that we all have the same lifestyle. We don't have to agree with each other in terms of like, I like the way you do things. I don't like the way you do things. I don't like your ideas. You don't like my ideas. We have a fundamental agreement when we talk about American values, when we talk about defending American values, when we talk about liberty and justice for all, when we talk about what it means to be American. The most fundamental value in all of that is the concept that in this country, you are free to live your lifestyle as you see fit, as long as you're not hurting somebody else's rights to do the same. You do not have to agree with it. You don't have to agree that it's moral. You can think it's weird if you want to. But I defend your right to be as weird as you want to be, as long as we can both agree that we have our right to live our life as we see fit. I don't know why we don't talk about it that way. We should talk about it that way. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement, and you frame it that way. It's good for you. It's good for me. It's fair for everybody. You mind your business. I mind mine. It's an American value. It harkens to an American tradition. Not everybody's a traditionalist, but some people like that invocation of Americana, liberty and justice for all. That slogan is progressive, but it's also traditionally American. Some people like that patriotic kind of sloganeering. Use it. Use it to your advantage when you can. You talk about transgender people, that is the big top line theme and narrative, which is c'est la vie. Live your life as you live it. I live it as I want to live it. We respect each other's rights. We don't have to agree, but we respect each other's rights. And it's mutually beneficial. It's a mutual arrangement. I'm not going to step on your toes. You have to agree not to step on mine, okay? You frame it that way. We need to inform the public that transgenderism is not a choice. It's not a social contagion. It's not propaganda. The schools aren't transing your kids. The media isn't transing your kids. Transgender people are born that way, and we have more and more data pointing in that direction. We know that there is a biological mechanism in utero which would explain how somebody winds up with male genitalia but a woman's mind, or vice versa, right? It's because the hormone environment in the woman's womb at different stages can have a different hormone profile, and the genitals develop at a different stage than the brain develops. Okay? People need to know. It's transgender people, they're a real thing. We also know from the data that if you look at a transgender person's mind, and also another way we need to talk about it, transgenderism is a biological reality. It's not just a social construct. It's a manifestation of the brain, and the brain is biological. And we know from the research into the biology that there are structural, physical, biological differences with transgender people. It is real. They're not just making it up. It's not just in their brain. It's not just a fantasy. What they're telling people about their identity is biologically real. It shows up in the research. It shows up in differences in the structure. It shows up when you compare their brain to a male brain versus a female brain, like your stereotypical male and female brain. You see that transgender individuals are shifted away from their sex towards the opposite sex. That's what the data shows us. When you ask me what a woman is somebody whose brain has been biologically gendered in that way. And it turns out that transgender individuals, their brain is developed that way. Okay? So we talk about it that way. And last but not least, the way that we want to talk about it, frame the right as being weirdly obsessive, hostile, aggressive, anti-American, for being against other people's rights to live their life as they see fit, for being against freedom, for wanting to have big government come in and tell you how you're supposed to live your life, how you're supposed to express yourself, what gender, what sexuality, what you're allowed to do. Frame the right as being unhealthily obsessed. You are obsessed with trans people. You can't stop talking about them. You can't leave them alone. Leave them alone. What is your problem? Leave them alone. They're not bothering you. Stop being so upset. You can't stop talking about it, can you? I don't know why you're so obsessed with this. It's really weird. Why are you so obsessed, bro? Like, I'm a straight man. I don't have a problem with a transgender person over there. Something's really wrong with you. You are super insecure that you feel like you always have to bully and harass trans people to feel better about yourself. Stop being so fucking weird and obsessive. You're obsessed, right? Frame the right as weird and hostile and aggressive and authoritarian for being obsessed with this issue, because they are. And focus on trans adults, okay? They will always try to bring it back to children. People get nervous about kids. We don't even have to go there, okay? Just say, you know what? Children are, like, parents have rights over their kids. You can just be vague about it. Focus on the right of adults. Force them to address the rights of adults, okay? Are you telling me that you're against adults having the freedom to do X, Y, and Z thing? Are you against adults being able to live their life as they see fit? Why are you trying to come after trans adults' rights? Why are you harassing all trans people, right? Don't let them focus on the fear-mongering, emotionally charged rhetoric of, they're coming after your kids, okay? And also remind people, suicidality is high among trans individuals. All of the data points in the direction of, if you give transgender individuals support for their identity, affirmative care, in other words, you're not denying their identity, you're not putting them down for their identity, you're not trying to tell them, well, just change, just be different from how you feel. If you affirm their identity, if you respect their identity, the data very consistently shows that reduces the rate of suicidality. When the right talks about transgender people are suicidal, they're suicidal because of the way that society treats them. And the data shows that. The data shows that when you are affirmative to them, if the community supports them, if you affirm their identity, their suicide rates go down. And that tells you that their suicidality is not just because they're just inherently suicidal. They're suicidal because of the way that society treats them. Stop being obsessed with them. Stop trying to bully and harass them. Stop trying to make them kill themselves. Be an adult, grow the fuck up, live your life, and mind your own fucking business. Okay? Mind your own business. That's it. I'll see you guys in the next one, okay? My transgender people out there, big ups. I'm sorry, that was cringe. I identify